We have with us this afternoon Robert M. Berger.
At this time, I'd gotten one promotion while in the Navy. When I enlisted in the Navy, they immediately made me a seaman first class, which was a big advantage because, you know, there's apprentice seaman and seaman second class underneath that. And so I started off in my electronics training with a good rank and a little bit better pay than some of the others, and then I got my promotion when I finished my training. And so I was going along well, but at the end of this training, I got my 30 days leave, and I went back home to Maryland and goofed off for a couple of weeks. Then I went down to the airfield near Washington, Anacostia, and called a plane ride back to the West Coast, where I had to report into San Diego for my next tour of duty. My next tour of duty consisted of dive bombing. You dive bomb by putting a nail in the end of a broomstick and walking around the base looking for paper, and you stick the nail in the paper, pick it up, and stick it in the bag. And so I dive bombed for a couple of days there. But then they asked me if I'd like to go over to the atomic bomb test at Bikini Atoll that was then being organized. And so I told him yes. I felt I owed the Navy something, and that was one of the few ways I could pay them off. And so I did sign up for the Operation Crossroads, as it was called. And after, and this started my seafaring adventures in the Navy. Long last, after spending better than a year in the Navy, I was finally going to sea. So I got on some dirty old transport and went out to Hawaii. That takes a week. And in Hawaii, I joined a destroyer, the USS Trip DD-403, and which was heading out to Bikini for the atomic bomb test. My assignment on the destroyer was not very well defined. Nobody really told me what to do. Most of them didn't know what to tell me. And so I spent my time getting the electronic equipment aboard the destroyer working, all except for one piece of equipment. It turned out that the sonar, which, you know, on a destroyer is a piece of apparatus that sticks a transmitting thing out of the bottom of the destroyer so you can detect submarines with it. Well, the sonar wasn't working, and I started working on it, and when I pushed a button and that sonar head started going down below the destroyer, down under the destroyer into the sea, a lot of water came bubbling up. And I, of course, hadn't had any experience with that, so I quickly pushed the up button, got that sonar head back up because I didn't want to sink the ship. And after that, I made an executive decision. The sonar works, doesn't need any more repair, no more work, and so I'll focus my attention to the other electronic equipment aboard the ship. The other electronic equipment, radios, radars, IFF equipment, most of them weren't working very well or at all. And so most of the things I did was change tubes, because in many cases, in those days, vacuum tubes were in all the equipment. Vacuum tubes had a finite life. A vacuum tube would burn out in a piece of equipment almost every week. Well, this equipment had been going for some months without anybody taking care of it, and so I would check out the equipment and change vacuum tubes to get it working again. In fact, the captain appreciated the fact that the radar was working again. One night he came in and got me out of bed and got me under the bridge and said, "Turn the radar on." And the radar worked, and he was able to see where he was and see where the other ships were, and he thought that was great. He didn't talk to me very much otherwise. This, of course, the time that I spent sailing from Honolulu out to Bikini was when I was working on the equipment. Once I went up to the mast of the destroyer, up on the top where there was a radar antenna that needed a little work on it. And while up there, I opened it up and I did something silly and I got a fairly severe electric shock, and I almost let go. But I didn't. If I had let go, I'd have probably ended up in the deep blue sea. But I managed to get most of the equipment aboard the destroyer working again by the time we got to Bikini. It took a week or so to get from Honolulu down to the Bikini Islands for the atomic bomb test. And so, let me see, check my notes again. At Bikini, there was a large number of other ships there. I'm not sure how many, 20 or 30 Navy ships participating in the atomic bomb test after World War II. And so we gathered there, and on the destroyer that I was assigned, at that point in time, I didn't have much to do except to keep that equipment working and stand watch at night from time to time. All petty officers had to do their tour of duty by standing watch. Usually standing watch meant you went to sleep on the torpedo tubes amidship. Didn't sleep very soundly because if anything happened, you had to wake up real fast. The ship I was on, the USS Trip, was not a target ship for the first atomic bomb test. And so for the first atomic bomb test, we backed off about 20 miles, and when the bomb got ready to go off, the word went out to face in the other direction. They didn't want, even though it was an underwater explosion, they didn't want you looking directly at it because the flash could easily burn your eyes. But as soon as, right after it went off, we were able to turn around, and it seemed like a minute later, you heard the sound go by, and you felt the heat go by. The heat from the atomic bomb test was a very well-defined wave of heat moving through the atmosphere out from the test 20 miles away. And after that several hundred-foot column of water that was generated by the atomic bomb blast, after it settled down, we then started back into the target area. But at some point in time, the guy standing up in the bow of the destroyer with a Geiger counter in his hand says, "Stop, back up." And so we stopped and went full speed astern because the radiation was still fairly strong in the target area, and we didn't want everybody on the ship to get irradiated. Although, as it turns out, I ended up after Crossroads with a pair of radioactive shoes. But they were nice black dress shoes, and some water had soaked into them with some radioactive debris in it. So I've saved them and wore them for many years, but only to dances. I didn't wear these nice black dress shoes anywhere else. But I had the hottest shoes on the floor there for a while.
This morning we are interviewing veteran George William Frazier. George served in the United States Air Force during the Korean War. He was born on January 29, 1931.
Didn't produce a throw-up.
Mm-hmm. George, when was, you have a picture laying there, the first lieutenant, second lieutenant?
Yeah.
Can you show that to the camera? It's how George looked when he entered the Air Force.
Oh, he's a good-looking fellow, wasn't
Yes, he was a good-looking airman. Now, George, let's talk about your Korean assignment.
Well, in the Korean assignment, I was assigned to a place called Kunsan. And can I hold it here so I can stick my finger on it? Kunsan is right here. All right. And when I was there, I got into the PX and I had to travel across Korea, Busan, that's where the ships came in and that's where the supplies came in. And in one of my trips over there, I had to not come back the normal way And that meant I ended up going to Seoul and then get on a train and went on to Daejeon, and then rode the back of a truck to get back to Kunsan. Okay? And the battle line essentially was pretty much the 38th parallel, except it hooks up a little bit into North Korea.
And the Korean War was going on at this time?
Yes,
This was in April 1953?
yes. And it went on for about, well, April to July 27th, when I was there.
Now what organization were you assigned to when you reported to Korea?
Well, I was at the K-8 base, and it was the, that was the identification of the group, at K-8 Air Force Base in Kunsan, Korea. This was the 3rd Air Base wing of the 5th Air Force. And my assignment was to be the administrative officer, the office manager of the communications squadron. This is a picture. I was not in this picture, but this was a recent picture of this group, and the building in the back of it is the crypto bunker, and it was built in 1938 by the Japanese, and we utilized their base that they had built during the Korean War.
Now when you talk about K-8, you're talking about an Air Force base, is that right?
Right.
Okay. And what kind of birds did they have there, and what did they do?
Well, the F-84 Corsairs and B-26s. The F-84 planes had 6 Browning machine guns that shot half-inch shells and rockets and dropped napalm and bombs on the enemy. I and many others had a very scary experience with an F-84 machine gun. We were in its line of fire of 50 shells from the machine gun, accidentally caused by a short by the technician that was working on the plane. Nobody, fortunately, was injured, but the holes in the roofs were massive in their size. The Marine Corsair is normally an aircraft carrier plane, but it had been moved to K-8 for ground support and had Marine pilots. That turned out to be the GIs, the infantry people's favorite plane, because it could always get in closer and do a better job of supporting them. Just before I departed K-8, I was assigned to assist the Marines in returning their planes to their aircraft carrier, and I met many of them and watched them at play. They gave me a wooden labyrinth hand and skill game, and they used it to compete with each other on the quickness of controlling the surface, so that a metal ball would not go through the many holes and go through the whole course, and they would time each other. As a test, they would, after that run, they would all have a drink and then go through another round, and the winner was the guy who did it all in the shortest time until they all dropped out. Now, the other plane was the B-26, and it was a nighttime bomber, and it bombed trains and bridges throughout North Korea. One of the pictures that I had, but through a movie camera, was a picture of a B-29 almost at sunset with its bombs loaded on the wing. So this was still an active bombing activity.
Tell us what happened next.
Well,
While you're still assigned to K-8, you went...
yeah, with K-8 and the communications squadron, I was sent off to the ABC school in Japan.
Tell us what ABC is.
Atomic, Biological, and Chemical Warfare. And the school was located near Hiroshima, where the first bomb the atomic bomb was dropped. And as part of that training, I was taught how to suit up to handle radioactive material with an airtight uniform and during a very warm day. So I hope never to do that again. I also saw demonstrations of the chemical warfare, phosphorus, and napalm explosions. A very scary school, but very beneficial.
1951, went to Lackland Air Force Base, and then sent me back to Greenville, South Carolina, and I stayed down there for about a year, and then I was discharged. I got out of service.
Mm-hmm. And what did you do after then?
I went back home and went to work.
Thank you, Mr. Dodd.
My name is Roger Greenhall, live in Glenaire, and this is a talk about World War II. And I enlisted when I was in high school. My junior year in high school, I was 17. The idea was if you did that, you could pick your branch of service. And my father had been in the Army a long time, 21 years or so, and he said, if you really want to see the war, you should get in the Army. Well, I didn't really want to see it, but I got in the Army because they had a special program going called Army Specialized Training Program. And the idea was if you qualified, they'd send you off to college to study a course of interest in the Army. So I applied for that, and I got accepted. And of course, like all things in the Army, there's a but. And they said, but you have to take basic training first. And you're going to take your basic training at Fort Benning, Georgia, at the infantry school, which I did. And so while I was there, the war is going on and there's casualties coming up. And the Army decides that, well, they need soldiers, not students. So they canceled the program. So I'm in the infantry now. And they sent me off to Louisiana to the 86th Infantry Division. And the war continues and more casualties, and they decide they need infantry replacements. So I got picked along with a bunch of others, and I got fed into the chain, which took us to New York, across the Atlantic to England, across the Channel to Belgium. And I got assigned to the 9th Armored Division, 60th Armored Infantry Battalion, Company A, 9th Armored Division. And we were in Luxembourg on the border with Germany. And we were there when the Battle of the Bulge started. And we had about 240 men. We were defending about a 4-mile front. Well, the Germans attacked with like 500,000 men, so they just ran right over us and around us and through us. And so a bunch of us, we got separated. And we came together, and about a dozen of us, and we worked our way back to the American lines down in Luxembourg City. And there we got put into a group under George Patton, who was assigned the job of relieving the 101st Airborne, which was at Bastogne. So we fought our way up through Belgium to Neufchâteau into Bastogne, and we relieved the 101st. And then we started out with 240 men, but a few weeks later we had 40 left, so it was pretty serious stuff. But anyway, much later in life, much later, after I moved here, I learned through various sources that the unit that I was in had been awarded the Presidential Unit Citation. And I got interested in that, so I contacted the Army, and they asked me for certain information, and I sent them military records that I had, plus my discharge papers. And it went into whatever process they went through. And eventually came back, and they came back with this presidential unit citation, a copy of it. This is a unit citation, not to an individual. But it's awarded to Presidential Unit Citation, awarded to Combat Command A, 9th Armored Division for extraordinary heroism in military operations against an armed enemy from 16th December 1944 to 22nd. And the date it was signed is 2001, signed by the Secretary of the Army. So how did that come about? Why so late? Well, it turns out that when the Iron Curtain came down and East Germany and West Germany were joined again, the U.S. military personnel could get into East Germany, and they dug out German military records, and in those records they cited this unit as having so disrupted their plans and delayed them and so forth that they missed key objectives on their timetable, and then they got bogged down, and so the Allies had time to bring up reinforcements and so forth, and eventually defeated them. So anyway, I got this, and they said, oh, by the way, since you were in the combat, you get a Bronze Star as well. So I got both those here at Glenaire in 2004, more than 50 years after the event, which I think is unusual. So I found out about this because I was on the internet one day after I retired, and I just entered my unit designation just as a search argument. Boy, I got an immediate hit. There's a guy who had written a book about it, and he was a Dutchman. Paul Kruuk, I think it is, C-R-U-Q was his name. And I contacted him, tried to get a copy of the book, and there was a very limited publication, so I had him print up another one, which he did. I paid for it, but I was glad to get that. But as a child, he was with his parents, and they went on, in the summer vacation, they went touring some of the battlefields of World War II, and he found a dog tag of an American soldier. And he got interested, and he tracked him down. The guy was still living, and he was a member of this unit. And Paul Craig got interested in this unit, and he did a research program on it, and he wound up writing a book about it. So, and then I heard about it from him. He said, you know that your unit got this award? I said, no, I didn't. So that's why I contacted him. So kind of a roundabout way, and very late in the game, but very unusual, I think. Right. So, anything you don't know about that I haven't told you?
Well, what did you do after you got home from war?
Well, after I got home, I went back to college.
Mm-hmm.
When I graduated from high school, I went into college, and I was in college when I got a letter postmarked 8:30 in the morning of my 18th birthday calling me up. And I contacted him and they let me finish the term, so I finished one term of college when I was in. So when I came back, I wanted to get back into it, so I went immediately back to school. Spent the next 3.5 years.
Yeah. And what did you study in college?
I was studying electrical engineering.
Wow, okay.
And then when I graduated, I went to work for IBM. I worked for them for 40 years and retired in 1989, unbelievably long time ago.
And so where were the main places that you traveled during your service?
Well, Georgia, Camp Livingston, Louisiana, spent a small amount of time in Baltimore, New York, Fort Dix, and then we sailed across the Atlantic on the Mauritania, which is a fast liner which sailed unescorted. Figured he could outrun the U-boats, which he did. We landed in England, got staged through various British military camps, and then loaded up on a boat, shipped across the channel to France. And that was an interesting trip. We took a British scow called the City of Canterbury, held about maybe a couple hundred of us. And the idea was we were going to sail across the channel and land at Omaha Beach. This is after D-Day now, at the Mulberry Harbor. And so we get on the ship, and it usually takes about an afternoon to do this. We got out in the channel, and the weather turned bad, and we spent 5 days churning around in the English Channel waiting for the weather to clear. And of course, we ran out of food the first day because they expected to be, just a half a day trip. They issued us a bunch of sea rations, and we lived on sea rations. Well, then after we got to the shore there at Omaha Beach, we went through the staging process, and that ship put us in the back of a truck, and we traveled across France. We run through Paris, went straight through Paris, didn't stop at all, and then on up into Belgium and then Luxembourg. So I spent time in France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and England. Most of the time in England, as a matter of fact. So that's my story.
Thank you, Mr. Greenhall. Your name, rank.
James W. Klutz, and my rank was corporal. I was in the U.S. Army, the Corps of Engineers. I had training at Fort Jackson, South Carolina, and additional training at Fort Belvoir, Virginia, with the Corps of Engineers. I was sent to the Philippines by the Army. They had a program after World War II. This was in 1950-51. They had a program with the Philippines to do mapping of the entire nation, and that had been going on a while. I was there for 16 months. I did field work, mapping, measuring, and helping to control aerial photography, which was then sent to Japan and used in drawing maps of the Philippines. I was discharged after 2 years in August 1952.
All right, thank you, Mr. Klutz.
I was in between 1956 and 1959.
Okay. Do you remember any of your training experiences?
Yes, nothing really memorable. I went in, I was a navigator in KC-97, which is a model right there. And that was in Texas. And it was just like going to school, basically.
Did you travel anywhere else?
As a student or as a learning navigator? No. I stayed in, this was in Houston, Texas. And we had a baby, our son. And after a year of training, I was assigned to MacDill Air Force Base, which is in Tampa, Florida, and was there for 2 years.
So did you stay in touch with your family during all of the trainings?
Well, Pat Pat was with me, and at the end of my training session is when our son was born. So I was on free leave for about a month because it was so close to graduation and a time of being transferred to a job. So.
So what did you do when you weren't in training?
When I wasn't in training,
Yeah,
well, that took up pretty much an 8-hour day.
yeah. Anything you did for fun?
Well, of course, being in Texas was nice, and we could go to the coast, to Galveston, and some of the historic places in Houston and around Houston, and we pretty much enjoyed that.
Did you make some friends while you were there?
Yes,
Did you keep in touch with them afterwards?
yes. One who also lived here in North Carolina. We lived in our home state's Ohio. This fella that lived here in North Carolina was a friend, and we have another, and after that, we have a friend who was from Pittsburgh, and we still remained friends with them. And we had a friend from Oklahoma, and we remained friends with them. And I believe that's about it.
Yeah. Is there any one memory that stands out to you from your time?
That's been a long time ago. No, all I can say is that Pat and I both enjoyed military life. Our son was very sensitive, and when I would go on a mission, I would be gone for days or hours or what, and I would tell him goodbye, and he developed a nervous problem. So I knew I couldn't stay in the Air Force any longer. So I rode out my 3 years and went back to civilian life.
Oh, that's very sweet. Well, thank you, Mr. Lice.
Anytime.
If you would state, please, your name.
Well, I'm called Ed Thompson. My name is Rufus Ed Van, E-D-V-A-N, Ed Van Thompson.
Great. And what branch of the military did you work in?
Service I was in the Army.
In the Army.
In World War II.
In World War II. Okay. And were you drafted or did you enlist?
I was drafted because I really, I was in college, and I finished college, and I was ready, and I got my call to go right after I finished college.
Okay.
So I went, and everything was fine. On my way over, I had been going with a college girl, and we were engaged. So on my when I started to go overseas, we got married.
Oh.
And I enjoyed the work with the Army, but I wanted to come home as soon as I could.
To be with your new wife.
To
be with your new wife?
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
So.
How was it for you to get through it?
How long?
How was it?
Oh, it was all right with me. We were in the 10th Mountain Division, and we were trained in up in the mountains of sometimes I can't, the words won't just come to me. I'm 99 years old. 99.
No worries if you can't remember the words. You trained in the mountains.
Yeah, in the mountains we trained, and I had an accident during the training, and I had to have a surgery in the Army hospital. And then when that was, I was able to come home just to recuperate, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And so I went back after I was ready to go back to where we were and so I missed my group had moved out and they all gone, and then I was with another group, and that's why and when we finished training in the mountains, we went down to Texas, hot Texas, and where we were in the mountains, it was cold, snow on the ground all the time, from September to April. So then I when it was over, we were headed home, but we learned that we were going to another area that won't come out right now. So, which would be a lot worse than where we were. So, but it was. I'm not sure now what it was. President Roosevelt was the president at the time I was there, and he died while I was there. So I went. You had to have so many. Something that they call out, they call points, so many points before you get your come home. After hours was over there, we were leaving to go to France, and that was going to be a rough time, and that's when the bombs were dropped on over there. The first bomb that dropped, they wouldn't stop, so they had to do the second. And so a lot of people said that I am so glad they dropped those bombs because that kept us from having to go, because it was over then. And it doesn't sound very good when you say I was so glad that they dropped the bombs over there, but let us not have to go. We turned around and came back and went home.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Did you make friends? Did you make a lot of friends?
Oh yes, I had friends, and I took it as it came, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Because I was a college graduate, they wanted me to go to officer training and become an officer. I said, I don't want to be an officer.
Mm-hmm.
I have a wife. I want to go back to my wife. But I'll do what you ask me to do. But I still had to go. But I told the committee that was going to, I said, I really do not want to go to become an officer. And the reason to. So they let me off, and I became I had two. I can't remember those since it's a long time ago, and I have not wanted to talk about it because I just wanted to let all of that go. And when I came, my wife was teaching school when I came home. Of course, she was teaching school, and there was a hard time to get teachers at that time. And so the principal got with her and said, do you reckon your husband would take over your classes and you go down to the 5th grade? They could not keep a teacher in the 5th grade. So she wrote and told me that, and I wrote back and said, yes, I'll do that. So I came home, and 2 days later I went in her school and finished the school time.
What grade did you teach?
Huh?
What grade did you teach?
It was high school.
High school.
8th, 9th, 10th, and 11th. That was, and the year I was there, the 11th grade, they started another grade, the 12th grade. So I was their teacher. They didn't like it very much because they loved Miss Thompson.
Did you enjoy teaching?
What?
Did you enjoy teaching?
No.
Oh.
I said, this is not for me. So I came home and immediately went to another college and changed my way. So then I was with the state of North Carolina the rest of my working life.
Great. And have you kept in touch with any of your friends from the Army?
Say that again.
Did you keep in touch with friends from the Army?
No, there were two friends from the Army who lived in North Carolina, and so we would get in touch frequently.
How do you, I just have one more question. How do you think your service and your experiences impacted your life?
I think so because it told me that I needed to go somewhere other than teaching, and I had gotten a school before, but when I came home from service, I called him. Or I know when I got my bid to go to the Army, I called the principal. I said, I'll be going to the Army very quickly after I graduate, and there's really no need of my starting. And so that was it.
Great.
January 17th, 2007, and I'm John Sloan here at Glenaire Retirement Community, and we are going to interview George Latham this afternoon, and so we'll let him tell you his name, where he was born and where he was raised and so on. George?
Okay, well, I was born in Patchogue, New York, Long Island. That's an old Indian name. On May 19th, 1925. And I went to school there for a while. Then I moved on to a tobacco farm in southern Maryland where my father and grandfather built barns, and I hoed tobacco. And then subsequently we moved to Washington, D.C. I went to college at American University, and I got my degree in chemistry about 1950. I was 4F during World War II because of my eyesight, and I got drafted at the age of 25 into the Army, and I served in the Army from the 29th of August 1950 to the 28th of August 1952. 2 years. When I got drafted, I went to Fort Jackson, South Carolina for my basic training, and we were an oddball company. We had about I don't know how many people are in a company, but it's something like 220 or something like that. And about half of us were college graduates. We even had a guy that had a master's from Harvard and got drafted. He wasn't in World War II, obviously. And about half of our company was composed of raw kids from West Virginia. And it was such a crazy bunch because these young kids were all very uneducated, really kids from the backwoods. And one incident I recall in basic training, we took one of them into the shower and scrubbed him down because he needed to take a bath. Well, after that, 8 weeks of basic training, the closest I came to real action, I guess you would say. I was a squad commander, and our squad was doing live things with hand grenades, practice throwing them out of a trench, and one of our little kids dropped the hand grenade, the live hand grenade, into the trench that we were in. Luckily, we had a real great company sergeant who picked it up and threw it over the side. So that was really the closest I came in my Army career to anything close to dangerous action. After 8 weeks of basic training in Fort Jackson, I moved on to Fort Myer, Virginia for reassignment. Prior to that time, I had been working at the National Institute of Health as a chemist, and I had my degree in chemistry. And so, in the Army's inevitable work, because I've been working on TB drugs, they sent me to Fitzsimmons Army Hospital in Denver, which was known at that time as a TB hospital. Oh, yeah. And that's how I got there. And I spent the rest of my enlisted time, 2 years, at Fitzsimmons doing chemical research. At one point in time, they gave me a group of 6 Army people who had TB, and I gave them an experimental pill, took blood samples from them over a period of about 2 months, and subsequently got a little paper out on the effects of this drug, which was not very effective, and I think that's probably about the closest I came to action, was Fitzsimmons Army Hospital and Denver, Colorado. Anything else?
Well, where did they process you out?
Oh, wow. I don't even
Remember that?
remember that. I think I was processed out at Fitzsimmons.
Mm-hmm. That could be.
And they put me on a plane and sent me home.
Right. Okay.
That's, I really don't remember that. I went to Fort Myers in the beginning from the difference between basic training and my reassignment. But I don't remember the place where I got mustered out, so to speak.
They might have just released you since the war was over.
Yeah.
So then you went back to civilian life, and what did you do then?
I went back to NIH and continued my career in chemistry.
Mm-hmm.
I started working on my master's degree, and eventually got married, and here I am.
Okay.
We've been married 50 years. So it's a very undistinguished Army career, but I must say that it was interesting. I enjoyed being in the Army. My Army career was a good one, and you know, I mean, it wasn't dangerous or anything like that, but it was interesting because I got to do some work that was sort of down my alley, and it was good. It was a good mix of the Army and being my civilian career, I guess you'd say.
Did you ever consider going for officer rank?
Oh yeah. I eventually got to be a corporal, and I was slated to become a sergeant when something happened. I guess the war was over then, and so I never did get to be a sergeant, but I went up through the ranks pretty fast. I got to be a corporal pretty quick, and I had a private room in a barracks, and you know, we went skiing in Denver. We went trout fishing and that kind of stuff. It was an enjoyable Army.
You really had no incentive actually to go for.
No,
I didn't either until after the war started.
Yeah, I took the OCS test, and I came out with the highest mark in the company that I was associated with, but I never really considered making it a career.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's interesting, and we appreciate your telling us these things. And
did you keep up with any of your buddies?
Oh yeah. Did
Oh
you?
yeah, I
guys
did.
You knew there? Did you?
Yes, I kept up with one guy who was a sergeant in our whatever you call it, our company or our lab, and he worked. After he got mustered out, he went to the Department of Agriculture. He was a plant chemist, I guess you'd say. And while I was working later on in later life, he came to visit me one time after I was married, actually, and visited us on Long Island when he was in New York for a seminar. That was the only person I really kept up with his name was Claude Smith. And I have lost all track of him now. I don't have any recollection of where they were now.
Were you ever approached about joining reserves?
Oh, yes. They put quite a bit of pressure on you, actually, to join the reserves. And I never did. I just sloughed it off somehow or other. I don't remember now. That's been some years ago. But I got a lot of publicity through the mail and so forth, and people would call me up and say, I think that they wanted me to join a reserve corps that was of chemistry majors, and it was I lived in Washington D.C. at that time, and it was the reserve status would have been in I guess at Fort Myers. That's the closest to Washington D.C. of all the outfits that the Army had. I mean, around Washington D.C. that was just loaded with all kinds. The Naval Research Lab was there, and so forth.
Do you have any advice that you would offer to a young guy who was contemplating going in the service?
Advice to a young guy contemplating going into the service, I wouldn't.
Okay.
I have a grandson now that's 15 years old.
Yes.
And that's my advice.
How long were you at NIH?
Pardon me?
How long at NIH?
Oh, I was at NIH for a total of 10 years. I have a 10-year service award signed by Dwight Eisenhower. I mean, it's a facsimile signature, but I was there for 10 years before I went to Brookhaven Lab, and that's where I was for over 30 years. Brookhaven National Lab in Upton, Long Island, and that was a national lab run by the Atomic Energy Commission when I first went there. And it had to do with atomic research, and the chemistry I did involved radioactive isotopes. That was the connection with the Atomic Energy Commission.
Yeah. You were basically trying to go back home, weren't you? Going back to New York.
Yeah, that's right. Yes, because Upton, New York, where Brookhaven Lab is located, was a very famous World War I camp, and they established the Brookhaven Lab at Upton, New York, in the Upton Army place, and most of the buildings were converted barracks. Where I first went to work was a converted barrack, and subsequently it's grown now. It's a large 3,000 employee laboratory right there in the wilds of the middle of Long Island, and they do mostly they do physical chemistry work, and that's what they're noted for.
Well, thanks for an interesting interview. And
thank you, John.
We'll get you a copy of this.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. This is a Veterans History Project of the Library of Congress. We are taping a veteran in Cary, North Carolina at the Glenaire Retirement Community. And this is September the 22nd, 2010. I'm Helen Leverton, and I'm happy to have with us today a veteran who is a new resident of Glenaire named Pat Stacy. And Pat, if you'll tell us about yourself, and when you were born, how you got into the Navy, and so forth.
Well, first of all, my full name is Edgar Patrick Stacy, and I was born in Ceylon, Minnesota on November 26, 1935. And it's kind of interesting. My mother was from Florida, and my dad was down there in construction work, and they got married, and as all people, he wanted to return to the fatherland. So they went back to Minnesota. The only problem was he had forgotten how cold it got up there. So he said in the summer of '35, he said everything was fine, but Mama was pregnant with me. And as it got on in toward winter, he said they were about to freeze to death and starve to death. And if it hadn't been for the generosity of friends and family, he said both might have occurred. So I was born November 26, '35, and I spent Christmas Day back in Florida. Was raised in the Southeast. My dad was called into Navy duty in World War II, and I've never really understood how he wound up in the Navy, but he did. He was a chief motor machinist mate, served throughout World War II, and so I felt some affinity for the Navy. In December of 1954, I saw where they were forming an all-Georgia company. At that time, we were living in Milledgeville, Georgia. Dad was still in construction work, of course, and they were forming an all-Georgia company to go in the Navy. So it looked like a good opportunity for me. So I enlisted in the Navy on January 29th, 1955, and along with a couple, 300 other Georgia crackers, we set off for San Diego, California for boot camp. Completed boot camp, and I had qualified for electronics school in Treasure Island, San Francisco Bay. So came home on leave and then went back to Treasure Island and went through 6 months of electronics school at Treasure Island. Was finished there, and I don't remember the exact day I finished, but I remember that I was on a Greyhound bus or a Trailway bus headed for Georgia on my 21st birthday. So somewhere we must have been about then. I reported back into the Navy on Christmas Day, 1955, in Seattle, or wherever the Navy is in Seattle, Washington. It wasn't the city of Seattle. It was one of the areas up there.
Bremerton, maybe?
I don't remember exactly, but at any rate, the thing was, the ship that I was supposed to catch at that time, for some reason, wasn't there. And so there was another fellow that went through the same electronics class I did, and he and I had run around in school together, and so we had volunteered for the same destroyer division, and so we were traveling together to catch our ships. So we left there and flew down to Long Beach, California, and caught our ship. I went on the Herbert J. Thomas DDR 833, and I probably reported in sometime of first or second week January 56, and the person I was traveling with, who happened to be Don Dean, reported to the Bush. And so that was in January, and sometime in that summer we left on our first trip to Westpac. I made 2 trips to Westpac. Returning my second trip would have been in the summer of 1958, and I thought that that would conclude my trips to Westpac, but the Navy had other plans. They immediately transferred me to another ship, to the USS Cogswell, DD 651, and I immediately shipped out again for Westpac. Completed a tour, got back sometime around the end of 1958 or early 59, was transferred to the receiving station in San Diego, California, and was separated there, if I remember right, on January 23rd of 1959. And I went from there to school at Southern Technical Institute, and couldn't make ends meet on just a GI Bill. So I joined the Naval Air Reserve and was flying radioman on a P-2V Neptune out of NAS Atlanta for the next 2 years while I finished my schooling. After that, I worked for RCA for a while. Then I worked state of North Carolina and was teaching school in Asheboro at Randolph Tech. That's where I met my lovely bride. We were married in November of 1964. And she followed me when I changed jobs and went to work for IBM. And then I retired from IBM in 1994. And that, in a nutshell, is what I did.
I'm John Sloan, and I'm here to interview a gentleman that's a neighbor of ours. And I'm going to turn this over now to John Wagnon, who will give his name and address, and then we'll go with it. John?
I'm John Wagnon. I live at 3111 Glenhope Court in Cary, North Carolina, which is a suburb of Raleigh. I've been here 5 years. I enlisted in the Navy in March of 1942. At the time I was working about 48 hours a week and going to school at night. I had completed nearly a little over 2 years and toward my degree. Well, I'd had 2 years of junior college, and then I had another 3 years in night school in order to get my degree. But I joined the Navy in March of '42, and I was then given permission to finish the work toward my degree, which I did complete in June of 1943. I was living in Atlanta, going to a division of the Greater University of Georgia. At that time, it's now called Georgia State University. I will go by this paper here and conduct my remarks accordingly.
Boot camp experience. Boot camp experience? What you have there?
Yeah, I did have, was called to active duty on August the 3rd, 1943. I have a real good memory for dates, incidentally. And went to midshipman school at Columbia University. I was there for 4 months, after which, at the completion of this 4 months, I was made an ensign and called a line officer. I had a gold stripe on my sleeve and 1 star for the which indicated a line officer. It was a entirely new experience for me, and I was happy when it was over with. Even though I was in a big city, I didn't think much of that. I had lived in a fairly good-sized city, Atlanta, but I missed the freedom that I'd had in Atlanta. It was a rather grueling 4 months. When I was graduated from the midshipman school in late November, I was asked to report for duty in San Francisco on December the 3rd, 1943. At that time, when I arrived in San Francisco and reported to the 12th Naval District, they informed me that my ship, the AK-98, the Auriga, a cargo ship, was somewhere in the Pacific, as they described it, and that I would be given temporary duty. So at 5 o'clock each night, I would go to the 3rd floor of the Federal Building in downtown San Francisco, and there were others, about 15 or 20 other officers who went, and we worked until midnight, correcting secret publications. Finally, I sailed on the 15th of February, 1944, to Pearl Harbor and reported aboard my ship about 5 days later. My first job assignment was First Division officer, and I had charge of part of the ship forward of the deck house. During general quarters, I was assigned to the 3-inch gun that we had on board. The ship had one 3-inch gun forward on the bow, a 5-inch gun, surface gun only, on the stern, and 8 20-millimeter guns. My roommate was an ensign, and after one trip, after 2 trips, we sailed from Pearl Harbor and went to Eniwetok and back, and then our next trip was from Pearl Harbor to Saipan, and from Saipan we went back to Pearl Harbor, and my roommate was then detached from the ship and went back to the States to be assigned to new construction, that is a new ship being built. At that time I was made the gunnery officer. And
how much training had you had on gunnery?
Practically none.
That's what I thought.
Practically none. After the Saipan operation, we were sent down to Hilo, Hawaii, and we loaded up the guns for a battalion of Marine artillery, thinking that we were going to go to Peleliu, I believe it was, or at any rate, while we were en route, along with a good many other ships, we got word that the Japanese had lost considerable aircraft in the fighting off between Saipan and the Philippines. They called it the Turkey Shoot, and that the entire force would be sent to Leyte Gulf. We went to Manus Island and then congregated there with about 600 ships left from Manus and also Hollandia and maybe some other ports, I'm not sure, but their lion's share were from those 2 ports. And we arrived in Leyte on the night of October the 19th. That was 1944. We did see some combat, and we heard MacArthur make his famous speech at 2 o'clock from the USS Nashville, in which he said, "I have returned." And I used a curse word there and changed his statement, "We have returned." At any rate, we then went from Leyte back to Hollandia, and we loaded up. We went from Hollandia over to Biak, and from there we went back to Leyte. We unloaded there in November, and at that time when we sailed into Leyte Gulf there in November, we experienced, or rather we observed the first kamikaze, and the airplane dived into a transport which was 2 or 3 miles from us in the anchorage. We went back to Hollandia, and then from Hollandia we went to Itapi. We loaded up an anti-aircraft unit there, and then we sailed a little after Christmas. I remember very well that we had to fuel our ship at sea. The swells were so great. We were already loaded with our cargo to go back to the Philippines, and we had to go to sea in order to have calm enough waters to maneuver and for the fueling operation. Then the doctor gave, this was Christmas Day, 1944. The doctor had to give us all a couple of shots for any for something that we might catch up in the Philippines. From there, we got back and we had to shift the cargo deck, the cargo on the decks, and reposition some because the ship had to be made level again for smooth sailing. We left from there and went to Luzon. We got to Luzon along with 600 or 700 other ships, and that was a rather grueling experience in a way, because the convoy could only go as fast as the slowest ship, and the slowest ship was really not a ship, it was a landing craft. And as I recall it, we were going about 8 knots. At any rate, we sailed into Lingayen Gulf on the morning of September the 9th, not September, January the 9th, 1945. We experienced the kamikazes, or rather we viewed some kamikazes hitting ships, and there were a lot of ships in the harbor, and a lot of big ships, battleships and cruisers included. I had an attack of kidney stones that afternoon, and they put me in a boat and sent me over to a hospital ship. I arrived at the hospital ship, and they said the doctors are all at their general quarters positions, and they'll come down and tend to you as soon as this air raid is over. And they had a sailor to escort me down to the lowest deck in the ship, and I got down there, and there was a big area, open area, where a lot of men were lying there in the bed, and 2 of those men, I looked at them carefully, they were bandaged from their eyeballs to their ankles. They had been on a battleship that had been hit by a kamikaze.
So they were suffering from burns.
Yeah, this was burns. And oddly enough, my kidney stones didn't hurt near as bad after I viewed those men. Maybe I became relaxed somewhat, and thinking that what I'm suffering from is not near as bad as what they're going through. At any rate, I didn't spend the night on the ship. I must have passed the kidney stone, and I was taken back to my ship. But that was a memorable experience to see so many of those men who had been burned so badly. I was never a prisoner of war. In fact, I never came face to face with any of the enemy.
Were you able to get mail in and out?
Oh,
while you were
yes.
on the ship?
Every
Every time you got into a port.
I beg pardon?
Every time you hit a port, you get some mail?
Whenever we got into a port, the supply officer had charge of the post office, and he would go ashore and get our mail and bring it back, and the mail was distributed to us in the wardroom just as quickly as it was sorted. One note of interest, I was corresponding with a young woman who I had met while I was in San Francisco and was later to become my wife. She had been reassigned to the Office of Messenger Mail Center. She was first class petty officer in the Navy, in the Naval Reserve. And later, when we got mail, there was a letter dated January the 8th, the night that we were sailing into Luzon, along with 600 other ships. And she wrote in that letter, she had access to where the ships were because they had a list of the ships there in the office where she worked.
This was Ruth?
Yeah,
Ruth
this
Bowman.
was Ruth. And she wrote me that night, I do not know exactly where you are, but I do know that you have plenty of company. All of those ships' mail must have been going to Eniwetok later to be redistributed all over the Pacific. After that, we left that operation. It might have been going to Pearl Harbor, but at any rate, she knew that I was in on something, and it's odd. We still have that letter. No, we don't have that letter. We have the letter that I wrote her right after that. I was awarded several medals and ribbons, and there were a total of 5 stars.
Good afternoon, Wayne. It's a pleasure and an honor and a privilege to be with you today and with the other veterans who will be represented here at Glenaire, those that are with us and those that have gone before us. My name is Robert Lyerly. I was in the United States Air Force from June of 1966 to June of 1970. And was stationed around the country. I began my tour of duty in Texas, went to Colorado, went to South Carolina, did my basic training at Lackland Air Force Base, where everybody did at that time. Then went to tech school in Denver, Colorado. Was initially stationed at Shaw Air Force Base with the 363rd Reconnaissance Technical Squadron. While I did not fly, we were involved with the training of air crews who flew the RF-101, the RF-4C, and the RF-B66. We also trained the members of the Alabama Air National Guard who also flew the RF-84 at that time. I went back to Denver for some additional training, came back to Shaw, went to Kadena Air Base, Okinawa, and was temporarily stationed at times in Itazuki Air Base, Japan, which was primarily when we evacuated for typhoons, and also did a 8-week tour of duty temporary duty in Osan Air Base, Korea. Some interesting times during my 4 years. I got to participate in a program that was a developmental program with a vendor who was developing a side-looking airborne radar and also camouflage photography. My basic specialty, and I rose to the rank of staff sergeant, as a photo, at that time, was a photo interpretation specialist, which by the time I left the service in 1970, I was a multi-imagery interpretation specialist. Everything was done with an aircraft. We saw very little satellite photography at that time. However, today, the people that hold my specialty are seeing things that we only dreamed about. I would say two most important events during my tour of duty, especially at Kadena Air Base, Okinawa, is I was there in December of 1968 when the naval crew of the USS Pueblo was returned to us from North Korea. And unfortunately, that was a high point. Unfortunately, I was temporary duty to Osan because of the North Koreans shooting down our U.S. Navy EC-121 and the loss of that crew and that aircraft. We used multi-sensor interpretation flying into Osan Air Base with our RF-4Cs and did a lot of work at that time with our South Korean counterparts. Probably my most interesting cultural experience was being in South Korea and learning about what it feels like to be 45 minutes by ground from your neighbors who in the north didn't like you very much and would probably wash over Osan Air Base in probably 60 minutes, give or take a minute or two. The other thing that I found interesting was being at Kadena and learning about the history of the island, the battles that were fought there, and at that time there was a real emphasis by Japan to have the Ryukyu island chain returned to the Japanese control. Did not happen while I was there. A real interesting experience one Saturday afternoon. 3 or 4 of us were off base outside in a little small village which was behind the base as opposed to the main gate, and we were just enjoying the afternoon. We had gotten some lunch and there was a crowd of protesters with their masks and with their signs and with their chants, and we were standing on the sidewalk and this gentleman in a dark suit and a white shirt came up to us. He was obviously of Asian extraction, and in a most perfect Harvard English voice told us, "Gentlemen, you do not want to be here." And believe me, it did not take us long to exit, which we did very quickly. As I said, I rose to the rank of staff sergeant. I headed up a photo evaluation team, a training team, a team that was evaluating new technical equipment that was aboard the aircraft. My particular unit in Kadena Air Base was the 15th Tactical Reconnaissance Squadron. Another interesting event there is we had a 13-foot python as a mascot. It was flown back when the squadron was on temporary duty in Thailand. It flew back in the cockpit with one of the captains or pilots, and we had it in a cage, and every month or so we would feed it a couple of chickens, and it always brought the dignitaries that were on the base at that time in to see a python eat a chicken. Not terribly spectacular, but it's interesting to see a 13-foot python with a bump that lasted probably 2 or 3 days, and then it slept for the rest of the time, and then toward the end of the month, it was time to feed it again. Most importantly, I think it's important and most important that I can say I am a veteran. I'm proud and honored that I and we are comrades in arms, brothers and sisters in a special fraternity, veterans in the service to our country. So whether you were the first to fight for the right to build the nation's might, weighed anchors in some foreign port, went into the wild blue yonder, walked on the shores of Tripoli, sailed through surf, storm, and howling gale, or did a long, long pull with your hatches full, let us take this opportunity this day and every day to thank the families for their sacrifice and service. And with sincere gratitude from a grateful nation, we thank you as veterans for your service and your sacrifice. It is said, once a Marine, always a Marine, but it can also be said, once a veteran, always a veteran. I would tell you at ease, be at peace, for those that follow us have the watch. I thank you for your time and patience today. I wish you fair winds and following seas. May God bless you, and may God bless the United States of America.
Great, great. But let me ask you one other thing.
Sure.
You went through basic training in Texas.
Yes.
And tell me about your first day of basic training.
Well, it was actually a first night.
A first night.
First night. I left Charlotte, North Carolina in the afternoon, flew to Atlanta on Eastern Airlines, my first airline flight, my first flight of any kind, on an Eastern Airlines Super Connie 121, which at that time was just referred to as the Super Connie. Landed about 8 o'clock in the dark in San Antonio, got on the bus, and was motored out to Lackland Air Force Base. The evening consisted of finally getting dinner, having all our belongings searched, and for most of us, having a lot of the things we brought with us sequestered that we actually never saw again. The next day was haircut day. The next day was going through a line where 2 medics stood on each side of a line of inductees and received our inoculations. Didn't like needles then, don't like them now. And the next thing we did was we got our uniforms. They didn't fit most of the time, but we all looked the same. We all didn't have any hair, and we all had sore arms, and we all had non-fitting uniforms. But as time went on, we were able to trade out and get the uniforms that did fit. Some we traded among ourselves, some we went back and said, listen, this just isn't going to work. And they were kind enough to make us look like we were in the military instead of a bunch of ragtags.
Bob, thank you so much for your service.
I'm John Hatcher. I first became acquainted with the military when I was 5 years old. My father was a company commander of the National Guard and was taking his company along with the 30th Division to Camp Jackson, South Carolina, and they let some of the officers' sons go with them. So I went to Camp Jackson with the National Guard for a week when I was 5 years old and learned to love the military and appreciate it. I drank my first Royal Crown Cola and moon pie down at Camp Jackson. Didn't do anything else for the military for quite a while, but in 1952, I was in school at Wake Forest, and some of my friends had gone into the military during the Korean War. In fact, one was killed, and I got sort of tired of hearing about people in the military, and I was not doing my turn, so I volunteered, joined the Army for 3 years, which I thought was no difference than it was for 2 years. I joined for 3 years and went in the Army. After 3 days at Fort Bragg, I went to Schofield Barracks in the territory of Hawaii for 16 weeks of light weapons infantry training. My father got a change of address from me, saying I'd gone to an APO number, and he called a friend of his in the Pentagon and asked him, said, you taking these boys right off of college campuses
into combat now? And he said, no. He said, we're taking some boys for Class A profiles to light weapons infantry basic at Schofield Barracks. So I went there for that time, had got overseas pay while I was taking basic training, and came back here and was reassigned to Germany, to USER. So I went to Germany with 51 other basic training people. Had just gotten out of basic training. Went to an artillery outfit, and they had told me I could go in EMPs, which is what I wanted. But we got an ACAC outfit. The sergeant major fell us out the first time we were there, when we first got there, and said he needed 2 people that knew how to type to work in battalion headquarters. I'd always been told you don't go volunteer for anything in the military, but I did, and my buddy and I did, and we worked in battalion headquarters the whole time we were gone. And I rose to the rank of sergeant, got out after 3 years and 3 days, and came back to school, and I joined the National Guard as a staff sergeant. And when I graduated from Wake Forest, I'd gotten in the National Guard, and I found out I could get a commission in the Guard with a college degree and 6 months on active duty as a first 3 grader, which I had. So when I finished at Wake Forest, I got my commission in the National Guard and stayed in the Guard till I was, for about 15 years. I got rose to the rank of captain, but I couldn't go to school anymore because the bank said if they could do without me for 90 days, they didn't really need me. So I got as far as I could with that. So I got out, and we were transferred to Moxville, North Carolina. And one day, General Ferd Davis came up and talked to a Chamber of Commerce meeting, and he said, well, there's Captain John Hatcher. Said the first thing he's ever done in his life was to resign his commission in the National Guard. But said, if you'll come to Raleigh and see me, I'll take care of that. So I came to Raleigh and saw General Davis, and they got me back in the Guard. And even though I couldn't be promoted because I couldn't go to school, the banks always said they couldn't let me go because they needed me at the bank. If I wanted to go to military school, then join the military full time, and I couldn't do that. So I did get back in the Guard and finished my just a little over 20 years. Some of the experiences that I had during summer camp, I'd go and leave my wife and the kids with her folks in Lewisburg, and always something would happen while we were camping. One morning I was called real early into BOQ. They said the dog had gotten killed, and one of the kids would fall and hurt themselves or something. But anyway, that happened, and I told a friend of mine named Carrie that I was going to summer camp, be gone for 2 weeks. We were going to Fort Stewart, Georgia at that time. And I said, if my wife's old car that we had was break down, I said, I want you to be prepared to look after it. Sure enough, that old car we had broke down, and she called him, and he came out there and fixed it and got her going. You don't forget things like that. But I've always loved the military and appreciate the opportunities that I had to serve, even though I couldn't get a whole lot of rank, not like some of my good friends had, but I enjoyed it and will always be thankful for the opportunities I had.
Tell me about your first day in basic training.
Oh, me. I was a long way from home, and I hadn't been away from home much. And I remember when I got up real early. I ring there was about the second morning. I had KP, and they got us up at 4 o'clock in the morning. And that morning, I went to work on KP, but I slipped off and went up to the latrine upstairs and cried my eyeballs out. And I became a man then because I kind of got used to it and had a good time then, and even though it was tough basic.
Do you remember your first sergeant?
Yes, sir. I remember the mess steward even more, though. The mess steward was the meanest man I've ever known in my life in basic training. And some of us, as soon as we graduated from basic training, we got his pay record. We were working at battalion headquarters temporarily, and we got his pay record and sent it to Japan. I don't know how he ever got his pay, but we kind of got even with the mess steward at that time. And the first sergeant was a whole lot better man than the mess steward was.
How did your services and experiences affect your life later on?
Well, it always had an imprint on me because my father was on active duty 5 years in World War II and came back and got his star finally before he retired as a brigadier general in the National Guard. And I kind of followed in his footsteps, but I couldn't get any rank as he had had. But I've always been thankful that I had the opportunity to serve in the military and enjoyed most of it very, very much.
John, I thank you very much for your service and for all you've done to make America what it is today and to keep us safe. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.
My name is Paul Brunswick. I was born in 1939 in Greenville, Ohio, small town of about 16,000. And I came from a farm family. The tradition was for the men to drop out of high school at age 16 and go to work on the farm. I decided I didn't want to do that because I didn't want to end up spending the rest of my life on that farm. So I had an objective of going to college, getting a degree, being a coach and a phys ed teacher, or at least a coach. I played sports in high school and was really interested in football, baseball, basketball. When came time to graduate, I couldn't afford to go to college. My parents didn't have the money. And since my two older brothers had both dropped out of school, I wasn't about to accept any help from my parents, even if they could. So my best option was to enlist in the military branch and get some training and education, save some money. I chose the Air Force because they offered the most training, most selective. I joined with two other buddies on the buddy plan, which meant the three of us would be together throughout our 4 years. Well, we took a bus down to Cincinnati, across the river, and at Fort Thomas we were inducted, and there was a plane going out every night to San Antonio, Texas for basic training. And they only had 2 seats left on that plane, and we drew straws, and I drew the short straw, so they went ahead. And I went the day after, and I didn't see one of them for 4 years, and I did see one of the fellows on a trip through Oklahoma City during one of my tech school transfers. So that's so much for the buddy plan. I started off basic training at Lackland Air Force Base in San Antonio. And it was only 4 weeks because I was selected for a tech school, and I was complete the rest of my basic training at tech school up in Francis E. Warren Air Force Base, Cheyenne, Wyoming, for communications specialist. After halfway through that, I was selected to go to cryptography school, and that meant filling out my DD 398 to get security clearance. And as a result, I had to stay there in Cheyenne and shovel coal for 2 months as a what they called a fire guard. I'd fire 4 furnaces. 8 o'clock at night to 8 o'clock in the morning, 2 months of that. And Cheyenne's not a really good place to spend the winter. Happy to get back to San Antonio to Kelly Air Force Base, where the crypto school had just been relocated from Scott in St. Louis. So I was in the first class to go through the new crypto school. At the end of crypto school, we got our assignments, and I was assigned to Wheelus Air Force Base in Tripoli, Libya. First thing I had to do was go to the library and look up to see where Libya was. I didn't know. And at the time, that was 58, that was about May in 58. And Eisenhower just come back from Tripoli, Lebanon. So we were confused for a minute, but it was Libya, thank God, not Lebanon. Tour duty was 18 months, and I was the mission there was security service. I was in the Air Force Security Service, which is later on changed name to Air Force Intelligence. But the mission of Air Force Security Service was to monitor all kind of traffic movements, conversations in Asia, Europe, Africa, Middle East, and we had a lot of intercept operators. We had linguists, and I was a cryptographer. And we had our own compound within Wheelus Air Force Base, and we had our own crypto center within the compound. We all had top secret crypto clearances, and we passed a lot of very highly confidential information. A lot of it was top secret, code word. And during the time in Libya, it was like a little small town. We had 6,000 troops on the base, 6,000 military personnel, and probably another 1,500 civilian personnel. Their dependents, wives and children. It was just, I said, like a small town, really like a small college. I played baseball and football and intramural basketball, but I was on the base football team, on the base baseball team. Got to travel up to Europe a few times to play other bases up in Europe, and that was a lot of fun. We had our own stadium. We call it Yankee Stadium, meticulously maintained by the natives who worked on the base, and it was really a very nice baseball field, as nice as I've ever played on. Probably equivalent to a AAA field. And worked when I first arrived in Tripoli. Since the tech school had been closed down for a year during the move, there was a shortage of cryptologists. So we were working 12-hour days, 7 days a week for the first 3 months. And that sort of interfered with my plans to pursue my education at the University of Maryland, which had campuses all over the world. And we had about 25 professors there at the Wheelus campus. So I got in my English, couple semesters of English, psychology, and world history, which was really an experience because it was taught by a German professor who really understood German history. And that was the beginning of my college education at the University of Maryland. After the 18 months in Tripoli, I was sent back to the United States and was stationed at the Pentagon. That was our headquarters. Headquarters was actually in Fort Meade, Maryland, about 60 miles up the road, but Pentagon is where our workstation was. And we lived at the Fort Myer South Post, which has now been annexed into the Arlington Cemetery. And just right up the hill from our barracks was the Robert E. Lee family home. And we could see it, look right out my window and see the family home up there right in the middle of the Arlington National Cemetery. And working at the Pentagon was quite an experience. We were in our special security office was in the lower basement of the Pentagon. The Pentagon has 3 basements, and we were in the lower basement. And one of the reasons I didn't go into the Navy is I had anyways, whatever the word is when you're afraid of being tight in a tight space. But it never bothered me because we went down the steps and never realized we were on the third floor of the basement. Had a very interesting experience. I had about 20 months to finish my tour of duty there at the Pentagon. I was able to continue my studies at the University of Maryland. Matter of fact, they had classrooms right there in the Pentagon. Interesting story there. It was a sad thing. Our squadron commander was a lieutenant colonel in Wheelus Air Force Base in Libya. He had been in the Second World War, like most all the senior officers had been. This was 1957 to 61. I was in the Air Force. Anyway, Lieutenant Colonel Sims was demoted, reduction in force, from a lieutenant colonel down to an airman first class because he didn't have his degree. That was just terrible. Anyway, he was in one of my classes at the Pentagon, University of Maryland classes. And I think he did eventually get his degree and get his rank back. The other eventful thing during my 20 months in the Pentagon was the Francis Gary Powers incident, where he was part of our operation, really. He worked for the CIA and the Air Force at a joint operation flying U-2 planes over Russian territory. And one night on May 1st, 1960, his U-2 plane crashed. He got down too low, and actually they shot him down. They had developed a rocket that could reach he was about 36,000 feet. The plane normally that glider, I guess it was, actually flew at 60,000 feet, but he'd gotten down low for a good look. He was shot down. Next day, President Eisenhower had to get on TV and lie to the American people. It was a white lie, because it couldn't admit that we had been spying on them for years. We'd been doing this. And of course, we got all the messages related to that night. I'll never forget how many messages we had coming in, because all the stations all over Europe, Africa, Mediterranean sent messages back to us, and we'd forward them over to the CIA, FBI. And that was another thing. At that point in time, those agencies cooperated with each other, as opposed to 2001. The agencies were not cooperating with each other, and that's why we had the 9/11 attack. That should have never happened, because we had plenty of intelligence. Different agencies had different intelligence, but they didn't put their heads together. So anyway, I continued taking my course at the University of Maryland, and in 1961, I had applied to the Ohio State University, which is 500 miles away, but it wasn't a long trip at that time, and got an early out, what they called. I got out a month early. I'd enlisted in October '57, so instead of getting out in October, I got out in September so I could start to college. And about September the 1st, I got in my '53 Plymouth and drove from Fort Myer back to my hometown of Greenville, and that was a big day in my life. I had two younger siblings, in addition to my older siblings, that were 11 and 10 years younger than I were. They were more like my children than my peers, my brother and sister. So we spent a few days together. Then I was off to Columbus to start my college at Ohio State. And earlier that summer, I'd been home on leave while I was visiting colleges. I considered a couple other universities. And I met up with my baseball coach, who was, I knew very well. He was also assistant football coach. And he asked me what I was going to do after, what I was going to study at Ohio State. I said, well, I'm going to be a coach, just like you. And at that time, he winks and walks, because, well, Paul, come on, let's talk. He says, Paul, do you know how much coaches make? And he told me, I think it was about $400 a month. And I said, well, that might consider something else. He recommended business. And I said, that's a good idea. He says, you can coach Pop Warner, which I ended up doing. Coached Little League Pop Warner and YBA basketball. But I didn't know what I was going to major in, but took my first two courses in accounting, and I really loved it. At Ohio State, you didn't take the bookkeeping first. You took managerial accounting first, and I saw that it was really a powerful tool that you use to run a business. Balance sheet, income statements, cost accounting. I was fascinated by that. I don't know how not many people think you can be fascinated by accounting, but I was. So anyway, I graduated in 3 years because I had a year of transfers credits from the University of Maryland. Met my wife about the second week on campus. She was from Cleveland. She's 3 years younger than me, but she was a sophomore, and so was I, by virtue of my credits. We were married in 1963. Both graduated in 1964. Went to work for Standard Oil of Ohio, and I think I pretty much had my choice of Fortune 100 companies. They all came to Ohio State to recruit to business school, and my military background, I think, was a big help in my ability to land a good salary. I had good grades, and spent over 60 years in accounting and finance. Just really retired 2 years ago from being on. I retired from Goodmark Foods in '99, but spent the rest of the next 12 years in 12 years in on boards of directors for a couple public companies and several private companies, and I still enjoy working on the numbers. See, big numbers are how you run a business. You don't run a business, but you have to have the right numbers to run a business. So that's the story of my military and essentially my life thereafter. It was one of the best decisions I ever made, and I will always appreciate the military.
Well, I want to thank you on behalf of all veterans everywhere, and certainly all the people here at Glenaire, for your service to your country.
Thank you.
Sounds like you had a very, very well-rounded and good career.
It was a good career. I was able to visit most every country in Europe, including Crete and Malta, which not many people go to. And the last question here was about, did we keep in touch? Have I kept in touch? Unfortunately, in those days, you didn't have email or cell phones. But I did connect with two of my friends. They were both cryptographers, and they were both one played baseball with one of them, played football with the other, over Facebook page, Wheelus Air Force book, actually Security Service, Air Force Security Service page on Facebook. And wish I had done more of that sooner, but it was a great career. Thank you.
Master Sergeant in the United States Air Force for 26 years. And started out in Lackland when there were no beds and no uniforms, and marched for 3 weeks in a pair of pants and a velveteen shirt, which was what was in the style at the time. And we finally got uniforms, and then we were put out to go to our different I'm sorry, I have trouble. Different bases. My first base was McGuire in New Jersey, and I was crew chief there for Royal N. Baker, who was an ace. And went from there. I was only there about 4 weeks. And then I was shipped to Korea. And I was a member of the reclamation crew and the recovery teams. We picked up plane in Incheon Harbor, a Navy, Air Force T-33, the F model, which was a photographer. And we got there just as low tide was hitting and changing over. And I managed to strip the plane of everything but the engine and the fuselage. And worked 2 lieutenants and a captain to death carried it off as I took it out. Then I went from there, to Perry Air Force Base in Sherman, Texas. And that was a training command base for fighter jets. I was there for 7 years. And then, this says 3, but that was wrong. And then I went to Saudi Arabia,
teaching Saudi Arabs to be aircraft crew chiefs, and found out what people were talking about when they said it was a waste of time, because it was. 13 months I didn't get mine to learn the tools or the toolbox, much less anything else. We picked up a T-33 that flew into a sand dune, and the sand dune covered it. And this was 3 years later. Arab come in and tossed a shoe with a foot in it on a desk and said, this belongs to y'all? And they told him, yeah, and that's where did it come from? And he told them, and they went out and dug a little bit in the dirt and got the airplane out. It had 2 crew in it, but they were long gone. And that's where I had got ruptured appendix while flying over the what they call the empty quarter. It's nothing but desert, and we were down there shooting landings on tops of sand dunes, and I was suddenly hit with pain like you'd never suspect. And we got back to the base, and they offloaded me out of the airplane, and it was 5 days later that I came to. And from there I came back to Peterson Field, Colorado Springs. Was a member of the pistol team. It's a great place for hunting. We managed to take national title in marksmanship pistol. Then from there I was shipped out to Korea, or Korat, Thailand. And we were flying 105s, bombing the Vietnam. And that was quite a time. We were busy all the time. Then from there I was shipped to George Air Force Base in Victorville, California on the Mojave Desert. And I was ready to retire when I got a call from the orderly room. Says, do you want to continue your retirement, or you want a company tour to Germany? And I said, hold on. I called my wife. I said, you want to go to Germany? And she said, do I have to pack? So we went to Germany and stayed in a dairy farmer's apartment he had in his house the whole tour. Went over for 3 years, and they extended us to 4, and then I extended us another half because I had my oldest daughter and a friend of hers, the major's daughter, we were keeping so she could finish school, and they finished school there, and then they shipped me. That was Bitburg. And I think I said, yeah, I went to George in the Mojave Desert, came back to Bitburg in Germany, and I ran the ward readiness materials for 2 wings. Took care of all the inspection work and cleanup and resurfacing and repacking, and did all of that. I had a crew of 3 staff sergeants and 2 Germans. And let me see. We lived, like I said, and the German landlord was a dairy farmer. And his favorite call and his total English was, Jesse, come with the coup, to go help him birth the cow. And from there I came back to Myrtle Beach Air Force Base and spent from 74 to 77 there, and had A-10 Tech Library, and retired with 26 years as a master sergeant. And that's the story of my time in the service.
Tell me about the happiest day you ever had in the military, other than probably the day you got out.
I was sad on the day I got out, but the best day I ever had was probably, I would say that it was in Germany, when I was in the barn helping a German birth a cow, and I had done it as a child when here in the States, and just one day he was doing it and was having trouble, and I helped him, and we got it birthed and real quick, and after that he called me anytime a cow was having a birth, and I think that was the happiest time, was having a live calf.
Well, now, you spent 26 years, you said.
26 years.
How did this affect Mary, your family?
Well, the thing was, every time I was sent overseas, it was unaccompanied. They wouldn't have the wife or children with you, and so they went home and stayed with their mother and father and had good times, and I think they enjoyed it. But they really enjoyed it when we went to Germany, accompanied.
Yes, I could tell that as you were talking. You were smiling more about that than any of the others.
We had a time.
Great. And your first day of basic training, you remember that?
I remember the first day of basic training as we got to Lackland and airport, and they picked us up with buses and took us to Lackland, and there were no barracks available, and they put us in squad tents, and we didn't have any uniforms or shoes or any of that issued to us for about 3 weeks, and that was my worst memory of basic training.
I had a brother who went through basic training at Lackland Air Force Base back in '70, and so he remembers that very vividly.
Yeah, well, this was in '50.
Yeah. Well, Jesse, I want to thank you for your service to your country, to all humankind, and certainly to us here at Glenaire. It's an honor to know you and to have served with you in another service, but it was all for the good of our country, and I thank you very much.
I thank you very much.
My name is Chester Black. I'm a veteran of 4 years service in the U.S. Navy. I enlisted in November of 1951 during the Korean conflict. I guess they finally called it a war, but it was a bloody battles. So I decided when I graduated from college and started teaching GIs that if I was called on to serve, because the draft was still in effect, that I owed this country something. That the people who had went before me had served, had protected, and held this country to high esteem. And it was going to be my job to do my part. Teaching those GIs just amplified it to me. There wasn't one of them that said they didn't want to forget their experience and what they'd been able to do and give. So I taught GIs, decided the time had come I was going to be drafted, and I enlisted in the U.S. Navy. The old chief petty officer that was doing the recruiting said, "I'm going to send you to the land of sunshine and prunes." And San Diego, there we went. Across the country, my first trip across the country by rail. Had a great time. There were several of us going at the same time. We became buddies and continued to serve with each other for a while. Went through basic at San Diego. Had a old Chief Petty Officer who was our leader, and he believed in discipline. And once in a while we'd mess up, and then he'd choose a day when it was raining up a storm, and he'd get out there and he'd march us back and forth across that huge concrete thing, and the waves would actually come up over your shoes. There was so much water gathering. But I'll hand it to him, and I always liked him because he was out there with us. He was going to teach us some discipline. But it seemed like I spent most of my Navy career in training services. I graduated from college. They interviewed me twice for officer candidates to school, and I turned it down both times because I really didn't want to make a life in the service. I just wanted to serve and do my part. In the matter of training, I lucked out. Nothing beats luck if you're on the right side. And I went through basic training, became an air corpsman, was transferred to Jacksonville, South Carolina, went through the Air Corpsman school there to get you ready, selected to go into the training division, and they sent me to Memphis, Tennessee for another 28 days. At that point, my career took a different turn because the girl I had left behind was ready to get married. We were looking forward to it when I got out of the service, and she said, "No, we're going to get married before the service." And I said, "I'd love it." So we got married, and that made a difference. So when it came time to where do you go, of course there were all the aircraft carriers, and a bunch of the boys wanted to go to that, so that was no problem. But they happened to have a training program for 2 billets in Hutchinson, Kansas, of all places. The biggest body of water was the Arkansas River, and it was 10 feet wide at that point. But they had a blimp station there, and they had converted it to a B-26 bomber squad for training purposes. So we packed everything in the car, got married, and went to Hutchinson, Kansas, and stayed there for 4 years. I can give you no war stories. I flew. They were kind enough to take us up. We were training the bomber pilots in procedures, the very basic part of it. And at the time, we were using link trainers when I first went there. They worked on a system of vacuum and electricity, and you could actually put someone in there, simulate him, get him lost, and he'd want to climb out. It was that real, just in a little old link trainer. But we trained them in procedures, trained them in approaches to how to fly. And I got to see the revelation that was going to take over in the military during my brief 4 years. Because we started out with that very basic piece of equipment, which was highly praised at the time. And when I left, a first class airman had asked me to join him, and we were running a sophisticated electronic training model that simulated what was going to happen in training in the military and other places. It was, for a person who was interested in education and that type, it was very interesting to me. I have no war stories I can tell you. I was privileged to serve. I was privileged to work with a bunch of real nice people. Some of them became lifelong friends. We corresponded for years. It was a pleasant experience. It didn't make you rich. It didn't break us. We had enough to eat. We had a good place to live. And we started our family while we were in the service. I have never hated that I spent 4 years of my life in the service, because I think it was the right thing to do at that time. And I feel in my heart that in some ways I may have saved some of those pilots' lives because they knew the correct procedures and knew what to do. And so that's my resume as far as my service goes.
It sounds like you had a great career. What was your first day of basic training when you arrived out in California? Can you describe that? Was it good? Was it bad? Was it like all the horror stories you hear about your first day of basic?
Yeah, it's a horror story. We were all proud of our pompadours, and they marched us to the barber shop the first thing. That will humiliate you and make you all even. That's the reason they do it. They want to make you all feel that you've lost the same thing. And they don't care if you're anti-Navy, because they know that in your heart you're going to come back around. So yeah, it was something, but you know, I never pulled a lot of KP or anything of that sort, which was the thing people tried to stay away from.
You had plenty to eat whether you were on KP or not.
That's one thing the Navy did. They fed their people. We had a lot of food. We had good food. There was always complaints that they were feeding us seagulls, not chicken, but you know, that was the way it went. And we had plenty of food, and I thoroughly enjoyed my basic training and all the training that I got in the Navy.
Well, aside from the fact that you were getting out, and that certainly made lots of people happy, what's the best day you ever remember when you look back on those 4 years? Is there one day or one incident that jumps out in your mind and says, that's the best thing that I ever did or that I remember while I was in the military?
Well, the military is pretty well a drum thing for the enlisted man's corps. They know when they're supposed to be there and what they're going to do when they get there and so forth. I didn't have a lot of really sharp experiences along that line. I was always happy to be there. The chief petty officer who was in charge of our unit was also the barber, and he took care of us. Even though we could go to a civilian barber, we went to him because he took care of us. So I don't know if there's anything that ever really stood out to me other than the fact that there were a lot of different experiences that I wouldn't have had any other way in serving in the military. And I think that's good for some young people nowadays. Going into the military will teach you some discipline. It'll get you oriented for life. And I think it did that for me.
Well, on behalf of veterans everywhere, and certainly myself, I thank you very much for your service to the military, to your country. Thank you so much, Chester.
Well, thank you.
My name is Bill Shepard, and I served in the United States Navy, and I entered in 1959 and served for a total of 6 years, getting out in 1964. And I served during the Vietnam era, but I was not involved in having to go over there. I went to boot camp at Great Lakes, Illinois, right off of Lake Michigan, and
that was a challenging time. At times, we had a 30-year veteran as a company commander in boot camp, and he was rather strict, and things that they did to us there, we had to march and march. I never marched so much in my life, but we had to learn how to march in formation. And the most challenging things in boot camp were having to go into the gas chamber and take your mask off and then get out in time. And the other one was fighting an oil fire in a building, and with fire equipment, of course, and putting the fire out, and it was so dark that you couldn't see where you were going. And so that, and then at night, before lights out at 10 o'clock, we'd be taking showers, and they would call a fire drill. And I was in there from October till just before Christmas, that December, and they would call a fire drill, and we'd have to go out. All we could grab was a blanket and hopefully a pair of shoes, and it'd be snow almost up to your knees out there, and there we were. And so that was about my experience in boot camp. And I served 3 years in Norfolk, and my last year was at McGuire Air Force Base in New Jersey. So when I got out of boot camp, I was assigned to the USS Shenandoah, which was a destroyer tender AD-26, based in Norfolk. And I was assigned to the captain's office as a mast yeoman, and my first commanding officer was Captain Robert Kelly, who was President Kelly's commanding officer over in the Pacific when he served aboard the PTO boats. And while there, I was mast yeoman, which where the captain dispensed punishment for infractions, and I was a court-martial reporter, court reporter. And then I was transferred to the USS Sierra, AD-18, to the Admiral's staff of Commander Destroyer Flotilla 4, based in Norfolk. And he was in charge of Project Mercury, which is the original 7 astronauts program. And if you recall, the Navy was in charge of recovering the astronauts downrange in the Atlantic. My first trip down to Cape Canaveral was for the last chimpanzee mission, which was either Sam or Ham, I don't remember which, but as I recall, there was a tremendous amount of interest in the chimpanzee's condition following the mission. Alan Shepard, who was in the mission control at that time, came bursting into the room and wanted to know the condition of the chimpanzee, and the veterinarians, of course, and the chimp performed all of his missions very well. And then the next mission was Commander Alan Shepard, who retired as an admiral. That was the first manned mission from Cape Canaveral, and our unit, who we wrote up and planned the operations and recovery programs for the astronauts, and coordinated all the ships and airplanes and communications. So we would man Mercury Control Center, and when Commander Shepard went up, he was only in space for about 15-20 minutes before he landed, but we, at the time of his shot, which was the Mercury capsule was
put on top of a Redstone rocket, which is a little rocket compared to the Apollo and the Gemini mission rockets. And but anyway, we were outside when it was time to blast off. We get down to T-minus 3 or 4 seconds, and then all but 2 or 3 folks ran out of the Mission Control Center to watch liftoff. And the ground really shook, believe it or not, and even though it was a smaller rocket compared to later models. But it was tremendously loud and a lot of vibration. And then we would, once liftoff occurred, we would go back inside and take up our communication posts and keep NASA informed of what was happening, and when Commander Shepard was picked up at sea. He had a successful flight, and a helicopter picked him up and took him aboard, and they landed on a aircraft carrier, and then he was flown to the Bahamas for debriefing. And so while down there, let's see, some of the things I remember in addition to that, I met all 7 of the original astronauts, and had a good long conversation with John Glenn, who was a colonel at that time and later senator from Ohio. But I did meet Wernher von Braun, who was the rocket scientist who came over from Germany, and he and I were standing down at a food truck, and there just happened to be a young lady from Australia who was covering the mission of Shepard at that time. And back then, I think these little paper milk cartons hadn't been out on the market too long, and she could not get in to she didn't know how to open that milk carton. And Wernher von Braun asked the young lady if he could help her. So she let him open her milk carton for her, and he got a chuckle out of that. Let's see. One other thing aboard the Shenandoah earlier that happened, it was during the summer, and we were in our white uniforms, and we'd get off the ship about 4 o'clock for Liberty overnight for those of us that weren't on duty. And one of my buddies went off the ship in his white uniform, and you could see bright red hearts through his pants. And the officer of the deck refused to let him go, called him back and said that he had to change before he was allowed to leave. So in the meantime, the officer of the deck wouldn't let any of the other personnel off the ship either, so we all had to wait for him to come back and be approved to leave the ship. So needless to say, he wasn't too popular the next day. And my last year, I was transferred to McGuire Air Force Base in New Jersey, and the Navy maintained 2 flying squadrons up there and 1 maintenance squadron to take care of the repair of the planes. So I was basically the secretary to the captain, and we stood duty at night monitoring the plane flights and whatever needed to be done there, and report to the Air Force. And so then my last year, I wasn't able, while I was in the Navy, I wasn't able to attend any schools because there weren't any openings. So I went to Pierce Business College in Philadelphia. I commuted from McGuire to Philadelphia 3-4 nights a week to learn data processing. And after, let's see, when I was discharged, I'd received orders 3 days before my discharge from the Navy and to go down to Cuba for the Bay of Pigs invasion. And so my personnel officer saw those orders and then knew that I was to be discharged a couple days later. So he said, I'm going to let you out now so that you don't have to go and your enlistment won't be extended. So I was thankful for that, and I went back home and then to South Jersey, and then I moved down to Harrisonburg, Virginia, and I went to work for James Madison University as their first data processing supervisor. And that's where Nicholas Oates spent some time there before coming to Glenaire as their dining director. And so I've had some nice conversation with Nicholas. And so then I retired then as the town manager of Dayton, Virginia, after serving 24 years. And I retired on disability due to my health condition.
Sounds like you had a very interesting career in the military, even though it was not 20 years or thereabouts, but you don't have to have 20 years in order to do a good job. And remember, do you remember your first day of basic training?
Yes.
Was it
well,
obviously something you'll never forget?
Yes, let's see. My wife now was Sandy Miller. She was married to Jim Miller, my best friend, and he was going to school in Philadelphia at Spring Garden Institute, and Jim and I had lunch, and then he walked me to the recruiting station there in Philadelphia, and then I enlisted. And then we were put on a train, and we went right straight to Great Lakes, and got there, and they threw so much information at us, and the personnel weren't too kind to us new folks coming in, and they tried to show their authority in ways that really weren't kosher to do. So it was a challenging time, and then you go get your hair shaved off, and then you go through a line, and you hopefully get the right size clothing and shoes, and then you go back to the barracks, and the company commander would give you one lesson in folding all your clothes to put in your little 2.5 by 2.5 locker that you had to keep everything in, and instructed us how we had to make our bunks, and but it was a stressful time the first time. And my first night aboard the USS Shenandoah, I got down there at about 11:30 at night, and the officer on duty called the sergeant at arms and took me. I'd never been on a ship before, even though I was raised on the water and had boats, and my dad had boats, and I was mate on fishing boats and everything. I had no clue where to go on this 900+ foot ship. They took me all the way to the bow of this ship and gave me a bunk. It was the middle of the night. Nobody told me where to go. When we woke up, where the head is what they called it in the Navy, where that was, where the galley was, where you go to eat, and didn't tell me anything. So I fumbled my way around, but eventually I landed where I was supposed to, and so that's. Well, on behalf of veterans everywhere, and certainly the veterans here at Glenaire, I thank you for your service.
Well,
You had a good career, and I and we are very appreciative of it.
well, thank you. I was privileged to do it. Thanks.
Hello, my name is Emery Anderson. I was one of these guys born in 1949, and I spent my service in the United States Air Force. I served for just over 20 years, starting from the Vietnam War era in 1971, the later part of Vietnam, through the first Gulf War and a little beyond that. That was the Gulf War called Desert Storm. And I retired from active duty as a lieutenant colonel after my service was finished. I served at bases in several places in the United States, including the Pentagon at one point, what we called the Puzzle Palace, and in the Far East more than once. That included Okinawa and South Korea, and then also spent nearly a year at a remote little island in the middle of the Indian Ocean, 1,000 miles south of India, called Diego Garcia, and I'll speak about that a little later when I tell you about the Gulf War. I entered the Air Force as a second lieutenant because I had been through 4 years of ROTC at Georgia Tech in Atlanta. Back then, during the Vietnam era, it was either ROTC or be drafted. There was no doubt that you were going in the military one way or the other, unless you were physically unable. So as part of that training, I didn't have the basic training that some have had, but I did have basic training. Was a month of summer field training, which I vividly remember as a month in the hottest, most humid weather you could imagine at Charleston Air Force Base in the middle of a hot summer. And it was hot. And there was no air conditioning in the dorms, nor in most of the buildings. My only memories of that were that we sweated a lot, and we always looked forward to the one class that we could have in an air-conditioned building, which was the recreation center, which didn't come very often. So mostly it was just sweated out. But after that, like I say, I entered the Air Force and served at several bases, and right there near the end of my career, I was stationed at an Air Force base in the name of Loring Air Force Base in the northeast tip of Maine, right next to Canada, 5 miles from Canada. And when Saddam Hussein went into Kuwait, you probably saw the first fighter wing go out of Langley Air Force Base in Virginia over to Saudi Arabia. What no one saw, because we were so remote in northern Maine, was that 5 or 6 days later, we sent an entire wing of B-52s that were loaded with conventional weapons when they deployed, and a wing of tanker aircraft to this little tiny island I told you about, Diego Garcia, which is it's actually a British trust territory, but the United States has a lease of 100 years on facilities and is allowed to use the facilities there. So that was our deployment base. About a week after that initial deployment of aircraft, I jumped on a KC-135 tanker with about 45 other troops, and we proceeded for a little puddle jump across the United States going west from Maine to California, stopped, boarded another airplane, puddle jumped from there to Guam, had another layover for fuel there, and then a long 12-plus hour flight from Guam all the way to the central Indian Ocean, 8 degrees south latitude, by the way, if you ever go looking for it on a map. On arrival, we found ourselves assigned to a MASH-style tent in a tent city on the coral. It's a coral island, and But we were fortunate we didn't have to be right on the coral. There were actually some concrete pads that they could anchor the tents to. And we were very fortunate later on to get some later style tents that were a little bit more comfortable. My job there was to be the deputy, the number 2 guy, to the chief of maintenance for this wing of B-52 and KC-135s that I told you about. And that included, that was about 1,000 maintainers that we had there to maintain this entire wing of 2 types of aircraft. It was basically a 24/7 operation. From August of 1990 to the next January of 91, we supported training missions for the airplanes to get ready in case we ever had to go to war. We honestly thought that the peace talks in Paris were going to avoid a war, but we had to be ready in case all that failed. And in fact, of course, it did fail. So our training missions ended as the peace talks failed, and we got ready for we called night 1 of the war. Getting ready for that first night involved generating to active status every single bomber that we had, with 2 spares, as I recall. And so they all had to be loaded with weapons, and it was a particular type of weapon because, as it turned out, we were going to be cratering dispersal runways so that Saddam couldn't disperse his forces out into the western desert. It was a little bit surreal realizing that the war was going to begin, and because of the amount of time that it took to fly from Diego Garcia all the way to Iraq, which was 7.5, 8 hours one way. We had already launched our airplanes well before any of you might remember, seeing bomb bursts over Baghdad or the TV reporting. So we knew what was about to happen, and we had basically launched about everything that we had, and were just waiting around to recover it. So I vividly remember watching a television set at our outdoor break area on the flight line that was connected to an Armed Forces radio and television station that was bringing in the ABC evening news, because with the time difference, it was the early in the evening in the United States, and we knew what was about to happen. And sure enough, I think it was about 6:37 Eastern time, and it was almost in the morning there where we were. The sun was coming up. We began to see those images on the television. So it was a little bit surreal knowing that. That began several weeks of daily bombing raids, which we would have to both return the airplanes to operational status and then make sure the proper bomb loads were loaded and the airplanes were fueled and ready to go. One of the things that happened that was a little nerve-wracking and kind of scary was that one night after we'd had a passing rainstorm on this tropical island, we resumed loading operations, and we were loading one of the B-52s on the ramp with B-52s on either side of it that were already loaded. And this particular one, we were loading they were loading weapons externally on a pylon under the wing, and with the rainstorm, it had wetted everything down. And when the driver of the loading device, the loading truck, swung in underneath the wing of the B-52, he stopped fairly quickly, and the bomb was pointing sideways. Well, with everything wetted down, the friction was not what it usually would be in a dry circumstance, and that bomb slid right off the edge. It was a 750-pound conventional bomb, and it slid right off the edge of the bomb jammer and buried its nose fuse right into the concrete on the ramp underneath a loaded B-52, loaded with weapons and fully loaded with fuel. tell you how serious that is, you know, had that bomb gone off, not only would it have enveloped that airplane, but it probably would have, the explosion probably would have caused explosions on the airplanes to either side. There were tankers across the ramp fully loaded with fuel, and behind those tankers were petroleum tanks, above ground petroleum tanks that, you know, the shrapnel could have set them on fire as well. So we could have had a major disaster from that. Fortunately, we didn't. But the first thing I saw were people beating feet, you know, up the parking ramp toward me. And that was my first indication that something went wrong. In retrospect, now, fortunately, the bomb didn't go off. We called the explosive ordnance disposal folks, and they came out and fairly expeditiously determined that the bomb was safe, and then we proceeded to remove it from the ramp and just continued right on, and we made the next series of missions. So you'd have to say all's well that ends well in that case. I have a picture of that bomb that impacted the ramp that we can add to this interview, and also a picture, an overhead picture of what that small desert island parking ramp, that tropical island there, the parking ramp looked like about 2 days before the war, with all the airplanes filling every single parking station, and sometimes in the taxiways because we ran out of parking space. Well, as you know, that conflict was proceeded to an expeditious end, and after that was over, the wing I was assigned to there was actually was awarded the Air Force Outstanding Unit Award, which we're proud of that, and looking back, I recall that I was actually awarded a Meritorious Service Medal just for the service, not for that particular incident I described, but you know, for the service there while we were there. While we were overseas, we stayed in touch mostly through postal mail, because this was 1990 and 1991, so it was well before email and the internet. And if you wanted to make a phone call to the United States, you had to use the British telecom service on the island, and that was $5 per minute. So you can imagine that not too many phone calls were made home. The chow hall food, that was fine. We actually did barbecue an entire whole pig one time there on New Year's Day because we had that day off, and we knew the war wasn't going to start, so we actually had New Year's Day off, so we barbecued an entire pig right in a pit we dug on the Coral Island. As far as our parts supply out there, the parts supply was adequate, but we really did find out what it means to be out at the end of the supply line. I think the supplies either came eastward and terminated where we were, or they came from the West Coast and terminated where we were, but we were at the end of it. For entertainment, well, we made our own entertainment, or we watched a TV. We bought an old TV from a departing permanent party Navy person to put in our tent, and there was, as I say, one Armed Forces Radio and Television Service station on the island, so we would watch that occasionally with the time delays. And the one other entertainment we had was that we actually set up a sort of a patio bar and grill outside one of the tents, and you know, in true tropical fashion, we called it Gilligan's. So we did quaff a few brews at Gilligan's. Other places that I traveled in my career included Taiwan and Hong Kong, Thailand, Central Japan. Always hoped I'd make it to Singapore or Australia, but never had the chance. We just ran out of time. Thinking of some humorous things that happened, I remember early in my career, my first duty station after training, I was in Central Georgia at an Air Force base, and I was the flight line, as a lieutenant, I was the flight line duty officer late one Friday evening when they said there was an incoming tanker coming from the West Coast. Well, this was in the days when Coors beer was not available east of the Mississippi River. And as you might imagine, people like to, on a deployment like that to the west, like to bring back some Coors beer. Well, the airplane came in and we rolled up the passenger stairs to the big door on the side of a KC-135, and they opened the door and I went up the ladder onto there and I greeted the crew and I looked in, and as I looked to my right, there was nothing but cases of Coors beer packed on top of each other, clear to the back of the airplane. I can't tell you how many hundreds of cases of Coors beer must have been on that airplane. But anyway, the less said, the better at the time, and somehow it all managed to find its way to its owners. Well, I can tell you that my service ended when after I came back from Desert Storm. Within the next year, I elected to retire, and actually my retirement, it was a drive out the base gate on the last day of December. So that was a fitting into the year, into my career, and we drove down the entire state of Maine that day, and I can remember spending the night in a motel with Carolyn in Kittery, Maine, just before you go across the border into New Hampshire. From there, we drove to Cary, where we had been just before Halloween. That prior Halloween, we had come down and we had negotiated to buy a house here in Cary, in the south part of Cary. And so we drove here to Cary and moved into the house, settled the family, put the kids in school, and then I tried some working for myself, multi-level marketing, that kind of thing, but found out that really wasn't my cup of tea. And so then I moved on to teaching computer software classes, and then also spent a goodly stint, learning the retail end of personal computer business, and some of the repair end, which eventually, after that, I managed to start my own PC repair business, which I ran for about 18 or 19 years. And concluded that about the time I moved here to Glenaire. And the last thing I could say is that actually, as far as friends from the military, I'm still in touch with my friends from the Desert Storm experience. You develop quite a bond with folks you've been deployed to in a remote location for a war. And this next January, about the 17th of January, we will probably all be together on the phone, because that will be actually 30 years, believe it or not, since the first night of the Gulf War.
Emery, thank you very much. On behalf of all veterans everywhere, I thank you for your service. Sounds like you had a very interesting career, and I look forward to hearing more about it someday. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Wayne. Appreciate it. Appreciate the opportunity.
Hello, I'm Carolyn Anderson. I joined the Air Force in 1974. I was a year out of college. I had worked for a year for my father in the restaurant business. And then I was a foreign language major, and I really wanted to do something with my languages. Unfortunately, there's not too many jobs if you don't want to teach. So I had a little bit of trouble trying to figure out what I wanted to do when I grow up. So I thought maybe if I joined the military, I would have a chance to travel and maybe have a chance to use those languages. So I applied to the Air Force, and at this point I don't remember why it was Air Force, but I did. And my recruiter said, well, don't you know anybody that can give you a letter of recommendation? And I said, well,
my father's business owner, partner as a senator. But being young and naive, I said, I've got a good record. I don't think I need that. Well, guess what? They turned me down. So I applied again and got the letter of recommendation just to see what would happen. And guess what? I got in. So I guess that was my first lesson in learning that if you have connections, you might want to consider using them. That's the way the world works. So I went to officer training school at Lackland Air Force Base, which is, or actually at Medina Air Force Base, which is adjacent to Lackland Air Force Base in Texas. And that was probably without doubt the hardest thing I've ever done. Physically, it was very tough. I'm not a real strong person. They advised me to run before I got there, and I thought, I'm not running any more than I have to. And guess what? I had to run a lot when I got there, and I wasn't prepared. I had terrible shin splints. It was not fun. It was a very tough time to be a woman in the military, extremely tough. There were nurses in the military, but there were no real line officers female line officers in the military. They were just beginning that. The class I was in, there were 2 of us in each flight. The class after me, there were 5 in each flight. So it was a time when they were really trying to figure out what to do with us. I was in a flight of 15. There were 2 women, and there was always one of us on the bottom of the pile. I did very well academically, and she really struggled. My roommate struggled academically, and she was very good physically, and I wasn't. So it didn't matter what we were doing. There was a woman to point to as being at the bottom of the heap. I mean, legitimately, we were. We had a flight commander who was very anti-women and turned the whole flight against us. And it was a very, very, very difficult time. Plus, I weighed 98 pounds and I had to weigh 100. I ate ice cream continually to try to get there. And, it was just a real struggle getting through. At the very end of training, we had the opportunity to decline our commissions, and I came about that close to declining the commission. I thought, if I'm going to be treated this way for the next 4 years, this is not what I think I want to do. Fortunately, there was a gentleman in my flight who had befriended me a little bit, and we talked, and he said, Carolyn, training is not what active duty is. So, please don't base your decision on how things have gone here. And it wasn't just my imagination. Training's hard for everybody, and I get that. But even the flight commander at the final interview said to me, if I had known how well you were going to do academically, I would have graded you differently at the beginning. So he essentially admitted that he had marked me down because he didn't think I was going to make it. And he didn't want to use his good scores up on people that weren't going to make it. It turned out I had the highest academic record in the class, and if he helped me out a little bit, we would have been in good shape. So it really wasn't my imagination. And the other thing that made, for 2 years I couldn't even talk about it. It was just so painful. And then fast forward, got stationed at Glenaire Air Force Base later on as a squadron section commander, and the chaplain from the training center ended up being the chaplain to my squadron. And I had a lot of interaction with him as a squadron section commander, so I said, well, you probably don't, in our initial interview, I said, well, you probably don't remember me, but you were the chaplain at Medina when I was there. And he says, oh, what flight were you in? And I told him, and he says, oh, the woman hater. And I thought, okay, this is not just me. So there was a lot of that at that time in the military, and sometimes it worked to your advantage and sometimes it worked to your disadvantage. I was always very, 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 very visible as a female officer. And sometimes I got special opportunities, shall we say, because they wanted to give a woman a chance. And at one point I had 30 additional duties just because they wanted a woman to do it. Whoops. So, you know, I can't say that it was all bad, but it was definitely there. And it'd be interesting to see how the military is now. I'm sure they handle it a lot better now than they did in those early days. Anyway, I got through training, accepted my commission, went on to Robins Air Force Base in Georgia, and I had a wonderful sponsor there, a very young lieutenant. I guess he was a captain by then. Well, either first lieutenant or captain, I can't remember at the time. Emory Anderson was my sponsor. And he took good care of me. He made sure I learned the ropes, and we became good friends, and eventually we became very good friends, and I've been married to him for over 40 years now. So that was a real positive part of my military career. I actually had a good assignment there. I was a admin officer to the commander of a maintenance squadron. Well, let me tell you, there wasn't an officer much greener than I. I was young, I was 22, I was female, I had no military experience at all except my 90 days of training, and I got plopped into this job. And there was just a wonderful chief there, Chief Master Sergeant Humphreys. I'll never forget him. He took me under his wing. He was old enough to be my dad. He taught me everything I needed to know to be successful. He made sure that I was doing well no matter what was going on. He was somebody I could go to if I had a problem, and knew that, and I learned the power of a chief there. He was an awesome guy. One of my first jobs I remember was taking minutes for the weekly staff meeting, and I swear they were speaking a foreign language. I didn't know any of those acronyms. You know, it was just one set of alphabet soup as far as I could understand. I'd go into the chief's office after the meeting and I'd say, "Okay, chief, what were they talking about?" And he'd talk me through the whole thing and help me learn what was going on. And eventually I didn't need him quite so much, and learned what I needed to learn. But it was just, I mean, it could have been such a tough experience if it hadn't been for people like Chief Humphrey that helped me through it. I mean, there was still some prejudice. One of my favorite stories from that time was I was walking through the main office, and there were like 2 or 3 female officers in the squad, in the whole wing. I mean, we were very, very few of us. And I'm walking through the wing, and from a ladder comes a voice calling me Sweet Pea, and I'm like, what? And he's, "Oh, I'm sorry, Lieutenant Sweet Pea." And I'm like, this will never do. Didn't say a word to him at the time. I walked back and I told the chief what happened, and within 15 minutes that gentleman was in my office with an apology, and he never called me Sweet Pea or Lieutenant Sweet Pea again. So there were definitely a few times where you had to put people in their place a little bit so that they recognized that you were an officer and gave you the respect that you should have. But the chief took care of that gentleman. I'm sure he never did that again. So I don't know what the chief said. I'm not asking. About the time I left Kadena, probably early, it was about 1.5 years at that job, because Emory and I got married. He got orders to Okinawa, and I went with him. And I was next the squadron section commander for an ammo squadron, 400 guys. I was responsible for the morale and welfare of those troops. And that was an awesome assignment. I mean, I really learned a lot. I had worked with some really wonderful people, and it was a good assignment. Commander there was a little bit prejudiced, but we managed. And that one was a lot more subtle, and it didn't bother me quite so much. And you know, a lot of times it's through someone else's eyes that you realize that you're not being treated fairly. The new commander walked in and he says, "I understand you're doing an awesome job. I know your performance reports are okay, but they're not reflecting the job you're doing." He says, "That won't happen with me." And he was great. He really did take care of me. So it was kind of one way or the other almost. Sometimes you got the advantage and sometimes you didn't. And here's another story with one of the advantages. I got the notice down that they wanted me to go to squadron officer school. So I thought, you know, Emory wasn't on the list. I was newlywed. I didn't want to go back to the States and go to squadron officer school. And I told my commander, let's just wait. He said, no, you got to put your name on the list because it takes forever to get to the top of the list. Put your name on. They're not going to call you. You're so junior, you'll never be called. So I put my name on the list for one of the 2 sessions. Guess who gets to go? And I'm like, so right after that, I had a commander's conference in PACAF, and they were like, "Oh, this is just great. You're going to commander's officer school. It's so competitive. We give you points for this and points for that." Couldn't help myself. I just looked at him and said, "Yeah, and how many points did you give me for being female?" Oh, no. But you knew that's what was happening. You know, there were times where I definitely had an advantage. And I think, you know, when something's new, people just don't know how to handle it. So anyway, I was at Kadena for about 2.5 years, and then we got transferred back to Omaha, Nebraska. And I did not have the security clearance I needed for that job. I mean, I applied to it, but the security clearances just take a long time for coming in. And so they kind of had me in a nothing position for quite a while, months as a matter of fact. And I was working for, guess what, another prejudiced. Do we see a theme here? It was a Navy commander who really could not stand the ground I walked on. And I got a poor performance report. Of course, I was doing nothing, you know, except additional duties, but fortunately I had a chance to go in to work for the general on loan because I couldn't do my job. And the general got to know me and knew that I was a good, solid officer, and the performance report came to his desk, and guess what? He overrode it. So again, you know, it's kind of up and down but so much of it was driven by prejudice. And you know, I think in these times, you really, having experienced some prejudice on your own, you really relate to the people that are going through that in our society today. So at that point, I got pregnant, and the little ones were on the way, and I'm like, this is just too demanding. I said, I cannot be a good mother and be a good officer at the same time. Both are very, very demanding roles. So I decided to leave the military and go into the reserves. And I was in the reserves then for, well, I guess I was active since 6, so I was in the reserves for 15 years, total of 21 years service. And that was a much easier schedule to handle with children. Still, it ended up being some challenges. I usually had to get a mother or mother-in-law in to watch the children when I was on active duty, or Emory had to take leave, but we managed. I had a really neat job there. I worked for I worked in the Crisis Coordination Center at the Pentagon, and when there are exercises or real life things going on, that was a center that was not fully operational on a regular basis, and it was run by reservists. And so when something happened, we would get called in and we would have to run the center, and and we did drills making sure we knew what we were doing and that kind of thing. Kind of an interesting situation, because usually a reservist goes into a unit and they're like, okay, what do we do with you, but in this case we were running the unit in the Pentagon, and we actually were the ones the active duty people came to and said, okay, how do we do this? So it was a very interesting assignment, and it was kind of fun to see how that center actually operated. Emory then got transferred to Loring Air Force Base, Maine, and I could not keep my assignment at the Pentagon because it was, I needed to be local for that particular reserve assignment, and since I wasn't going to be local, I needed to leave that billet and move on to a different one. So I went from there to a billet at JFK Airport, where I was in the mail unit, and it was okay, but it wasn't as exciting as what I had been doing. So I finished out a couple of years there, and then decided that it was time to just go ahead and retire. Well, first I guess I went into the inactive reserves, and then I retired from there. So I'm glad I had the service. I learned a lot. I had a lot of great experiences. Some were hard lessons, but great experiences nonetheless. And then I went on to be a military wife, which is a whole nother job in and of itself. And then we both retired. Well, Emory retired first, and I had to continue with the reserve duty, and I retired several years later. So that's about it.
You had a most interesting career. I wish we had another 2 hours to talk. Some similar experiences, being a male and female, both in the service. But I thank you very much for your time in the service, for your service to your country. And hope we can talk again. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Wayne.
Okay, so I'm on. Okay. My name is John Booth. This is November 2nd, 2020. I served in the United States Marine Corps I joined September 13th, 1961, and retired from the Marine Corps in July or June, I can't remember, of 1994. So I had a 33-year career, active and reserve. Almost 4 years active duty, spread over 2 or 3 different times. The first time was for 3 years. I went from September of 1964 to August of 1967, and then a couple more stretches there. And I've got the little interview notes here that'll keep my brain functioning so I can kind of run through this and say some things that might be of interest. I joined when I was a sophomore at North Carolina State University. ROTC was required for the first 2 years. There was a draft, and I'd always wanted to go in the Marine Corps. I had an uncle who I looked up to very much, and he had been a Marine in World War II in the Pacific, and was in 4 well-known battles: Tarawa, Saipan, Tinian, and Okinawa. He said he never expected to come home alive. So that, I always looked up to him. I joined the Marines because of maybe a sense of adventure, physical fitness, you know, those sorts of things, whatever goes through your mind when you're a 19-year-old young man and looking to get on with your life. So I joined when I was a sophomore at North Carolina State in their officer training program called the Platoon Leaders Class program, where you did not do anything during the school year, but during the summer, you went to officer candidate school. They didn't call it that, the Platoon Leaders Class program up at Quantico, Virginia, which is what I did in the summer of 1962. Wait a minute, I'm getting my years right. 1962, and in the summer of 1963, for a total of 12 weeks doing officer candidate school. It was physical training, mental training, but it was also screening to see if you had the capability to be an officer. So they did a lot of different things than they would have done at boot camp. So with the college degree and successfully completing officer candidate school, I was commissioned a second lieutenant in the Marine Corps on graduation in June of 1964. I was commissioned by Captain Carl Mundy, who was a recruiting officer here in Raleigh, but he would later become the Commandant of the Marine Corps. And when I retired in 1994, Carl Mundy was the Commandant, and I sent a message through his Chief of Staff, who was one of my buddies in basic school, and I said, "Would General Mundy mind retiring me from the Marine Corps?" And he said, "Sure, John, we do this all the time, send in your resume." So I sent in a resume to Carl Mundy, and at the time I was working for Baxter International in California, and on a business trip back to Washington, D.C., I packed my uniform. Rosie came along, and we slipped out of a business meeting and slipped over to the Pentagon, and it's been a delightful hour with Carl Mundy, and he retired me from my Marine Corps career. So I managed to show him how his handiwork had turned out 30 years later. So it was a very, very wonderful experience. There's a lot that I could talk about, but we've only got so many amount of time. I was in 2 wars, and then maybe more than that, because I fought in Vietnam with the Marines, the 3rd Marine Division up in I Corps. But I tell people that I fought in 2 wars. I fought in a counterinsurgency war that people still today don't understand, and then I fought in the best way to say it is, in a conventional war. And rather to get into too many of those details, I have, since this is for Glenaire, I have given Glenaire Library a copy of my memoirs. Here it is right here, which I have said more eloquently, and it took a long time. That's it. Duck your head and keep on going. It's sold on Amazon.com, but it's here in the library, and this tells my story in Vietnam more eloquently than I could ever say it. And so that's, if you want to know the story, go check it out in the library. What can I say that's memorable about that within the time we've got? Over one 6 weeks period, things were pretty rough. That was the conventional war part, and let's just say I lost 20 pounds. A couple times I wasn't sure I was going to come back alive, and had some close scrapes, but fortunately I came out of it okay, and came out with all my arms and legs. I thought about making the Marine Corps a career. I really did. Came back to Cherry Point, North Carolina, which was one of the best things that happened to me, because I was an artillery officer, and we kind of looked down at the air boys, Airedales a little bit. We used to tell them they're not the real Marine Corps. They left their brains up at 25,000 feet. And here I am being sent to Cherry Point, North Carolina as a ground officer, an artillery officer, and I said, that's terrible. Turns out in retrospect, it's one of the best things that ever happened to me for several reasons. Number one, it gave me a time to decompress from the things that had happened to me and the things I'd been through in Vietnam, to decompress in the military environment. And also, I got exposed to other parts of the Marine Corps that I would not have been exposed to. The Marine Corps sent me to Naval Justice School, for example, and turns out that it was such a very positive experience for me that when I got out of the Marine Corps, left active duty and thought about going back to grad school, I didn't know whether to go back in business or law. It was a very positive experience. So I subsequently went back in business, but I'm very grateful for that experience at Cherry Point. I had a chance to decompress and also wound up being honor guard company commander for the 2nd Marine Air Wing at Cherry Point, which was quite an honor being, in itself. So it was a very good last year on active duty. I thought about staying on active duty, but did not, primarily because it would be very tough to raise a family, and I knew I eventually wanted to I was married, but I knew that it was tough to have a family, be in the Marine Corps with the travel and so forth, all the moves around the country. It turned around in my civilian career. I moved equally as many times, but it was a little easier to hold a family together if you weren't on active duty. But I did make the decision that I was going to stay in the reserves. So when I left active duty in August of 1967, I joined the reserve forces and stayed in the reserves. My first job, my first entry into civilian life didn't work out too well. I won't get into the details. And I had thought about going back on active duty. But in fact, that was in January of 1968, there was a Tet Offensive. And I expected to be called up, and I was disappointed I was not called up. And you think, well, John, you're crazy. No, that's true. But then sane people don't join the Marine Corps. So after I wasn't called up, I thought about, did I want to go back on active duty anyway? But I had enough sense to figure out that was life happening to me instead of me happening to life. So I really thought about what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. And through that thought process, I eventually, quickly, went back to graduate school and got an MBA at the Darden School of Business at the University of Virginia, which was probably the second smartest thing I did with my life. And had 2 years at the Darden School, graduated in 1970, and then had a wonderful business career with Procter & Gamble and Baxter International at the same time, staying in the Marine Corps Reserve. As a result of that experience, I was in many reserve units all over the United States because both Procter & Gamble and Baxter moved me around quite a bit. Started out on the East Coast, but wound up in Mississippi, Chicago, Puerto Rico, Sydney, Australia, came back to California, had 3 moves in California, lived in Los Angeles, up around San Francisco, and then back in Los Angeles. So in all those many moves, I managed to stay in the Marine Corps Reserve and knew a lot of people in a lot of places. I was activated for the first Persian Gulf War and wound up being assigned, I was a full colonel, and wound up being assigned as Chief of Staff for the ground combat element of the 5th Marine Expeditionary Force in Camp Pendleton, California. I was in awe of the assignment I had, thought, hoped I was up to it, because I was taking the nation to war I was going to be taking the nation to war in about probably 10,000 Marines, in every sense of the word, like we did in World War II. Turns out I was very suited for the assignment because the 5th Marine Expeditionary Force didn't exist. And it was my job, along with some others, to bring it into existence. So we were going to be getting people from all over the United States. All my reserve experience means I knew a lot of people in a lot of places. So I wound up calling people up and saying, do you want to come back on active duty, and I'll put you in this job on the Marine staff. And whoever I called, the answer invariably was yes. I remember I called one of my good buddies who worked for Continental Can, and I called him and said, I'd like to speak to so-and-so. And the answer came back, well, sir, I'm sorry, he can't come. He's in the meeting right now. So I said, well, tell him it's John Booth, and this is the United States Marine Corps. And Bill Holohan was on the phone within 30 seconds. And he very quickly agreed to come back on active duty, and I told him what he'd be doing. Turns out the war was over so fast that I returned quickly to civilian life, so quickly. I was on active duty a little less than 3 months that my head was spinning. It was quite a change. In Vietnam, I had done a great deal. Came back to the United States, and we weren't exactly greeted with open arms. So I'd done a great deal, came back and was treated like a bum. Here, in this case, with the first Persian Gulf War, I was never in any physical danger. I had never left the United States. And when I came back to work, I was treated like a hero. You know, go figure, I never could figure that one out. So that was in 1991. That was actually the high point of my career. I think I had another year or two. I stayed in the reserves. But then came along at 1994, you had to retire after 30 years as an officer. So I took my retirement and have loved it. Don't know whatever else I can say. This is about 12 minutes, I think. So if you want me to go a little further, Wayne, you'll probably have to ask me a question or two, or...
Let me first thank you for your service.
Okay.
To the Marine Corps. I never think of the Marine Corps, but what I don't think of a story that I refer back to occasionally, and I probably have used it already with you, but I talked about, used to be in the Marine Corps, a former Marine, used to be. Somebody reminded me one day that once a Marine, always
That's true. It is very true.
So I no longer say such as that, but I do thank you for your service. When you look back on your, you went through a form of basic training somewhere along the line.
Yes.
Tell me about that first day, that first night of experience in basic training. What happened to you? How did it shock you? Did it shock you?
Well, I was in pretty good physical shape, so I got to say I wasn't really shocked. It was over 2 6-week periods. It was not boot camp. That's a big difference. In fact, this might be of interest to you, because when I was, the Marine Corps has the lowest officer enlisted ratio of any of the services, which means there's a lot of enlisted people but fewer officers. So in Vietnam, as a brand new green second lieutenant, I felt like I was immersed in a sea of enlisted Marines. And as I got to know these guys, they would kid me, and they'd kid me on the stuff. Oh, Lieutenant Booth, you officers, you didn't have anywhere near as rough as we did at boot camp. So I just kind of grin a little bit and say, okay, kind of whatever they say, because we did have it pretty rough. But he intrigued me a little bit, so I did ask occasionally, not occasionally, I asked someone who knew about this, and I said, tell me what is the difference between officer candidate school and boot camp. And he says, at the time, this was in the 60s, he said, Lieutenant Booth, boot camp is geared for a 10th grade education. Officer candidate school is geared for 2 years of college. And you have learned how to learn. Now that stuck with me all my life. The phrase, you have learned how to learn. And how that manifests itself in officer candidate school is in boot camp, for example, you may spend 40 hours on the M14 rifle. You get to go to OCS, they're still going to give you the same instruction on the M14 rifle, but instead of 40 hours, it might be 20, because you have learned how to learn. And then the additional hours that they had, they screened us and asked us put us through different types of experiences to make sure that we were qualified up here and here in our heart and mentally to be an officer. So that's kind of a long answer to your question. Of the 2 sessions, the first one I was actually a little disappointed with the physical rigor required. I thought it was kind of easy, a little too easy. When I went back for the second session, that changed my mind, because they put me to the absolute limits of my physical endurance. And if you ask any Marine officer what it was like to go through the hill trail up at Quantico, Virginia, it's a common experience we all share. And one other experience about officer candidate school, if you're going to be an officer in the Marine Corps, everyone, once they get commissioned, whether you come from Annapolis or Elks Breath University up in North Dakota or North Carolina State at Raleigh, North Carolina, will go through an additional 6 months of officer training at Quantico, Virginia, called Basic School. And once we all go through that, you can't tell the difference when you get out. So, Wayne, that's the long answer to your question. So,
thank you so much again. I wish we had another couple of hours, but looking back at your book, I have read that book. I recommend it to anybody that will take the time to read that. Quite a ride.
Okay, I would recommend to any veteran who has been through a war to write your memoirs. I didn't write it because I wanted to sell the book. I wrote it because, because I wanted a permanent record of my war experiences for my children. But in the process, I found out it was more therapeutic and cathartic than I would ever have imagined. And as a result of this, I'm able to sit down for the most part, I don't tear up. But I'm able to sit here and talk about it because I'm able to put all I went through down on paper. And not all my friends came back. So,
thank you, John.
Thank you.